Listen here, child. Gather close now under this old twisted oak that's seen more blood than raindrops from heaven above. I was gonna tell you about a woman named Harriet, strong-backed woman, fierce soul, who bit the hand that whipped her and paid a price that'd make the angels weep and the ancestors cry out from across the dark waters. This ain't no fairy tale spun from sugar and lies. No, sir. This here's the raw truth carved into the flesh of our people. The kind of story that gets whispered in the quarters when the moon hides her face and the paddy rollers ride the night roads with torches burning bright. Down in Virginia, where the tobacco fields stretch like green seas of sorrow and the big house looms white as death itself, there lived a woman who refused to bow her head complete. And when she struck back, Lord have mercy. When she sank her teeth into that overseer's hand like a cornered panther, the whole plantation knew the fire gonna rise and somebody gonna pay dear. Now hush your mouth and open your heart, 'cause what I's about to tell you ain't meant to comfort, it's meant to remember. Now you see, people, little Harriet come into this world in the year of our Lord 1820 or thereabouts. Time was a thief back then, stealing records from the enslaved like it stole our names, our languages, our very souls. She was born in a mud and timber cabin in the slave quarters of Wexford Plantation, deep in the red clay country of Virginia, where the James River runs slow and dark, carrying secrets it wouldn't never tell. Her mama was a field hand named Abeni. That was her true name. Her African name, though Massa called her Betty, like it was his right to rename God's creation. Abeni was strong as an ox, with hands calloused from picking tobacco from can see to can't see, from first light till the stars came out to witness our suffering. Her skin was the color of rich earth after a rain, and her eyes, Lord of glory, her eyes held the memory of baobab trees and wide African skies that she'd never seen but somehow remembered deep in her blood. Harriet's daddy, sold off when she was but 6 months old, vanished like mist in the morning, sent down to the deep south where cotton was king and men died in the fields like flies in summer heat. All Harriet knew of him was the stories her mama whispered in the dark, how he was a man of iron, how he sang work songs in a language the overseers couldn't understand, how the brand mark on his shoulder was shaped like a crescent moon. "Your daddy," Abeni would say, holding little Harriet close in that cramped cabin where 8 souls slept on dirt floors. "He carried the spirit of warriors. Don't you never forget that, child. That same blood runs in your veins." In them days of deep sorrow, childhood for the enslaved was a fleeting thing, quick as a hummingbird's wing. Little Harriet played in the red dirt between the quarters with other children. Pickaninnies, the white folks called them, like they wasn't precious souls made in the image of the Almighty. They made dolls from corn husks and played games of hide and seek among the tobacco rows, laughing despite the heavy spirits that hung over that cursed land like Spanish moss on a graveyard cypress. But even then, even in them tender years, Harriet saw things that scarred her young mind. She seen old Moses, a grizzled field hand with a back crisscrossed with whip scars like a map of suffering, collapse in the August heat, and the overseer just step over him like he was a fallen log. She seen pregnant women forced to labor with their bellies pressing into the earth, suffering something terrible while Massa sipped his mint julep on the veranda. She seen children sold away from they mamas at the auction block in town, heard the wailing that cut through the air like a knife through flesh. The old ones warned us, they did. The elders who remembered Africa, who carried the wisdom of root doctors and conjure women, who knew the names of orishas and spirits that watched over our people. They gathered the children in the praise house on Sunday, that little wooden building where we was allowed to worship under the watchful eyes of white preachers who preached obedience and submission. But after the white folks left, the real preaching began. "Listen here, children," old Mama Zuri would say, her voice crackling like dry leaves. She was a powerful, strong woman, a conjure woman who folks swore could see tomorrow in yesterday's dreams. "The masters think they done broke us, think they done stripped away everything that make us human. But they wrong, child. They wrong as sin itself. The ancestors still watch over us. The spirits still speak in the rustle of the tobacco leaves. And one day, the fire gonna rise and these chains gonna break." Harriet listened, her young heart beating like African drums, absorbing every word like rain-starved earth drinks water. She learned the spirituals that carried coded messages. Wade in the water meant use the river to throw off the dogs when you runnin'. Follow the drinking gourd meant look to the North Star, that drinking gourd in the sky, to find your way to freedom. Swing Low, Sweet Chariot spoke of the Underground Railroad, that secret network of stations and conductors who guided freedom seekers to the promised land. But knowledge came with a price, always did. When Harriet was just 7 years old, 7, she was put to work in the fields. No more playing, no more childhood. The overseer, a red-faced brute named Silas Crowe, oh, that devil's name still makes my blood run cold. He come riding through the quarters one morning on his big bay horse, whip coiled at his side like a sleeping serpent. "You," he barked, pointing at little Harriet with his tobacco-stained finger. "You big enough to work now. Get to the fields, girl." Abini's heart went heavy, chest got tight, but what could she do? Nothing, not a blessed thing. She watched her baby girl walk toward them, endless rows of tobacco, shoulders already beginning to bend under the weight of bondage. That first day in the fields was hotter than the hinges of hell. The burning sun beat down without mercy, turning the red clay to dust that coated Harriet's throat and made every breath feel like swallowing ground glass. Her small hands meant for holding dolls and climbing trees, now gripped the tobacco leaves, pulling and stripping till her fingers bled. "Faster, you lazy wench," Crowe shouted, cracking his whip in the air above the workers' heads. The sound of it, that sharp crack, was like thunder without rain, a promise of pain if you slowed even a second. Harriet worked till her back screamed, till her legs trembled like newborn foals, till sweat poured down her face mingling with silent tears. Around her, the other enslaved folks sang low, work songs that set a rhythm, that made the unbearable just barely bearable. "I've been down in the valley so long, Lord, I've been down in the valley so long, trouble gonna find me, but I's gonna stay strong. Lord, I've been down in the valley so long." When the sun finally set, when that cruel orb sank below the horizon like it was ashamed of what it had witnessed all day, Harriet stumbled back to the quarters. Her mama was waiting, and when Abeni saw her baby girl's bloody hands and exhausted face, she wept silent tears that fell like rain on Harriet's dusty head. "Mama," Harriet whispered, her voice hoarse and broken. "How long? How long we gotta suffer like this?" Abeni held her daughter close, rocking her in that cramped cabin, while outside the paddy rollers rode past, their dogs barking and their torches burning holes in the darkness. "I don't know, baby," Abeni said, her voice heavy with centuries of pain. "But you listen to me now, and you listen good. They can chain our bodies, but they can't chain our spirits. They can take our labor, but they can't take our souls. You remember that, Harriet, you remember." But then came the day that changed everything, the day that carved itself into Harriet's memory like a brand burned into flesh. She was working near the edge of the field when she heard a commotion, ruckus and hollering coming from the whipping post near the big house. All work stopped. The overseer forced everyone to watch. That was the way of it, make us witness each other's suffering to break our will. There, tied to that post with his shirt torn away, was a young man named Solomon. He was maybe 16, 17 years old, with skin like polished mahogany and eyes that still held defiance despite the fear. His crime? He'd been caught with a book trying to learn to read. In them days, learning was forbidden fruit, more dangerous than poison, more threatening to the masters than any weapon. Crowe stood there with his whip, not just any whip, but a bullwhip with bits of metal woven into the leather, designed to tear flesh from bone. "Let this be a lesson to all you darkies," Crowe shouted, his face red with whiskey and hate. "Any of you think you better than what God made you for, this is what you get." The first lash fell, then the second. By the fifth, Solomon's back was a landscape of blood and torn flesh. By the 10th, he'd stopped screaming and just hung there, held up by the ropes binding his wrists. Little Harriet watched, her young mind trying to understand this cruelty, trying to make sense of a world where wanting to read could get you near killed. She felt something shift inside her that day, felt the rage rise like fire in her belly, felt the first spark of rebellion kindle in her soul. When they finally cut Solomon down and he collapsed like a broken doll, Harriet whispered a promise to herself, a vow she'd carry all her days. One day the fire gonna rise, one day we gonna make 'em pay. That night, as Harriet lay on the hard ground of the cabin, her mama came and sat beside her in the darkness. Abini knew. Mothers always know that something had shifted in her daughter's spirit. "Harriet," she whispered, "what you saw today, it's the way of this world we trapped in. But don't let it make you hard, child. Don't let it kill the light in you." But Harriet's voice when she answered carried a steel that hadn't been there before. "Mama," she said, her young voice sounding old beyond her years, "when I's grown, when I's strong, I ain't gonna bow my head forever. I swear it on the ancestors. I swear it on your daddy sold away. I swear it on every soul that crossed them dark waters in chains." And outside, the night wind picked up, rustling through the tobacco leaves like ancestral voices whispering, "The fire gonna rise, child. The fire gonna rise." Sweet Jesus. Time moves strange when you livin' in bondage. Sometimes it crawls like molasses in winter. Sometimes it flies like a hunted rabbit. Before Harriet knew it, she was grown into a woman. 17 summers had passed since that first day in the fields. 17 years of endless labor under that skin and heat. 17 years watching her mama age before her time, bent double like a tree in a storm. But Harriet? Lord have mercy. That girl grew tall and strong with shoulders broad from years of field work, and hands that could strip tobacco or chop cotton with the best of them. Her skin was the color of rich mahogany, and her eyes, folks swear on their lives they seen. Her eyes burned with a fire that made even the other enslaved folk nervous. She carried herself different, you see. She had a way of looking at overseers that said, "You may own my body, but you don't own my soul." By then, Harriet had birthed 2 babies. Little Moses, a boy of 4 with his grandmama's gentle eyes, and Sarah, just 2 years old, sweet as honeysuckle and twice as precious. Their daddy was a man named Jacob from a neighboring plantation. But Massa had sold him off just after Sarah was born, sent him to the auction block in Richmond without so much as a goodbye. That pain, that soul-burdened anguish of losing the man she loved, only hardened Harriet's resolve. She worked harder, not because she loved her enslavers, but because she needed strength to protect her babies. Now listen here, child. In the quiet of the quarters at night, Harriet would hold her little ones close and sing to them. Not the spirituals of submission the white preachers taught, but the old songs, the secret songs passed down from the root doctors and griots. "Hush, little baby, don't you cry. Mama gonna take you by and by. North star shining, moon up high. One day we gonna touch the sky." She dreamed of running north, following that drinking gourd in the sky to freedom. But the chains of love held her tighter than iron. How could she leave her babies? How could she risk the swamps and the paddy rollers and the dogs for just the chance, just the possibility of freedom? So she stayed, and she worked, and she waited. But in 1843, everything changed when Silas Crowe's attention fixed on her like a hawk on a field mouse. Crowe had been overseer at Wexford Plantation for near about 10 years by then. He was a cruel overseer, mean as a snake and twice as venomous, with a belly full of whiskey and a heart full of hate. Tall and broad-shouldered, with a red face that turned purple when he was riled up, he rode through the fields like the devil himself, whip always ready, eyes always watching. The old folks say, and they don't never lie, that Crowe enjoyed inflicting pain. He wasn't like some overseers who just did their job mechanical-like. No, sir. This man took pleasure in it. He'd smile when the whip cut flesh, laugh when folks cried out. He was pure evil wrapped in human skin, a no-good man if there ever was one. And he had taken notice of Harriet. It started subtle-like, the way poison starts subtle before it kills you dead. Crowe began riding past her section of the field more often, his eyes crawling over her like insects on carrion. He'd call her out specifically for inspection, making her stand before him while he circled round, breathing his whiskey breath on her neck, touching her shoulder to check her strength, he'd say with a leer that made her skin crawl. The other women in the quarters warned her. Old Mama Zuri, still alive and still conjuring despite her advanced years, pulled Harriet aside one evening after work. "Child," she said, her wrinkled hand gripping Harriet's arm with surprising strength. "That overseer got his eye on you, and it ain't no good eye. I seen this before. You gotta be careful here. Men like that, they take what they want, and ain't nobody gonna stop 'em." Harriet felt her heart beat like African drums, felt the rage building in her chest like a thunderstorm gathering. She knew what Mama Zuri meant. Every enslaved woman knew. The threat of sexual violence hung over the plantation like a dark cloud, always present, always terrible. "What can I do, Mama Zuri?" Harriet asked, her voice low and troubled in mind. The old conjure woman looked at her with eyes that had seen too much suffering, too much pain. "You pray to the ancestors," she said. "You carry this mojo bag I's gonna make you, gopher dust mixed with sulfur and graveyard dirt, tied with red thread. Keep it close to your heart. And if he come for you—" She paused, her ancient face hard as stone. "You fight, child. Even if it cost you everything, you fight. Better to die with dignity than live without it." That night, Harriet couldn't sleep. She lay in the cabin with her babies curled up beside her, listening to the night sounds. The hoot of an owl, bad omen some said, the distant howl of paddy roller dogs, the creak and groan of the old quarters settling in the darkness. She thought about her mama, dead now these 3 years, worked to death in them tobacco fields. She thought about her daddy, sold away before she could even remember his face. She thought about Jacob, torn from her arms and sent God knows where. And she thought about her children, her precious babies, and what kind of life awaited them in this cursed system. "Lord," she whispered into the darkness, "give me strength, give me wisdom, and if trouble come, give me courage to face it head on." The next day, trouble came riding on a big bay horse. It was late afternoon and the work was near done. The sun was sinking low, painting the sky in shades of blood and fire. Seemed like an omen, looking back on it now. Harriet was working at the far edge of the tobacco field, nearest to the old tobacco shed where the leaves was hung to dry. She heard the horse before she saw it. Hoofbeats on the hard-packed earth, coming closer. When she looked up, there was Crowe, dismounting with a grin on his face that made her blood run cold. "Harriet," he called out, his voice slurred slightly from the whiskey he'd been drinking all day. "Come here, girl. I got something to discuss with you." The other workers nearby suddenly found urgent business elsewhere, melting away like morning dew. Nobody wanted to be near when Crowe had that look in his eye. Harriet stood her ground, her hands still holding tobacco leaves, her heart pounding in her chest. "Massa Crowe," she said, keeping her voice steady even though fear gripped her throat. "I got work to finish before the bell rings." He laughed, a sound like gravel in a tin can. "Work can wait," he said, stepping closer. "You and me gonna take a little walk to that tobacco shed yonder. Got some inspection to do." In that moment, Harriet knew. She knew exactly what he intended. Knew that if she walked into that shed with him, she'd come out changed, violated, broken, used like property, because that's all she was in the eyes of the law. Just property, just a thing to be used and discarded. The mojo bag Mama Zuri had given her, hidden in her dress, seemed to burn against her skin. She heard her mama's voice in her memory. "They can chain our bodies, but they can't chain our spirits." She heard the ancestors whisper, "Fight, child, fight." But she also heard the cries of her babies dependent on her. If she resisted, if she fought, what would happen to Moses and Sarah? Would they be sold, beaten, killed to punish her rebellion? Crowe was close now, close enough that she could smell the whiskey on his breath, see the lust and cruelty in his pale eyes. "Don't make me ask twice, girl," he said, his voice dropping to a dangerous purr. "You know what happens to disobedient slaves." Harriet's mind raced, her soul torn between submission and resistance. Time seemed to slow down, each second stretching like taffy. She could hear her own heartbeat, loud as drums. She could feel the weight of centuries of oppression pressing down on her shoulders. She could sense the spirits watching, waiting to see what she would do. And then, from somewhere deep inside, from the place where her daddy's warrior blood still flowed, from the place where her mama's strength resided, from the place where the Middle Passage survivors' spirits lived on, came a voice clear as a church bell. No. It was just one word, but it changed everything. Harriet looked Silas Crowe straight in the eye and said, loud enough for the few remaining workers to hear, clear enough that there could be no misunderstanding. No, sir. I ain't going nowhere with you. The silence that followed was deafening. Even the birds seemed to stop singing. Crowe's face went from red to purple, his eyes bulging with rage. No enslaved person, especially no enslaved woman, had ever refused him before. What did you say to me? He hissed, his hand moving to the whip at his belt. Harriet stood her ground, though every instinct screamed at her to run. I said no, she repeated, her voice steady as stone. You can whip me, you can sell me, you can kill me dead right here, but I ain't walking into that shed with you. For a moment, just a heartbeat, Crowe seemed almost impressed by her defiance. Then the rage took over complete. He grabbed her arm, his fingers digging into her flesh like iron claws, and started dragging her toward the tobacco shed. You gonna learn, girl, he snarled. You gonna learn what happens when you defy me. And that's when everything went wrong, or right, depending on how you see it. Harriet felt something snap inside her, felt all the rage and pain and suffering of her entire life, of her entire people's history, rise up like a tidal wave. As Crowe yanked her forward, she stumbled, fell against him, and in that moment of closeness, without thinking, without planning, purely on instinct and fury, she turned her head and bit down hard on his hand. She bit the hand that whipped her. She bit with all her strength, felt her teeth sink into his flesh, tasted his blood on her tongue. Bitter and metallic, the blood of her oppressor. Crowe screamed, a high-pitched wail that echoed across the fields. He tried to pull away, but Harriet held on like a dog with a bone, like a woman possessed, like someone who knew this might be her last act of defiance and wanted to make it count. When she finally released him, his hand was torn and bleeding, deep tooth marks visible in the flesh. He staggered backward, clutching his wounded hand, his face a mask of shock and agony and absolute fury. You bit me, he gasped, as if he couldn't believe what had just happened. You filthy animal, you bit me. By now, people had started gathering, field hands drawn by the commotion, other overseers riding over to see what the ruckus was about. They stared in horror and amazement at the sight. Silas Crowe, the feared overseer, clutching a bloody hand, and Harriet standing there, her mouth stained with his blood, her eyes blazing with defiant fire. One of the other overseers grabbed Harriet, wrestling her arms behind her back and binding her wrists with rope. She didn't resist, didn't see the point now. She'd crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed, done something that would demand terrible retribution. But as they dragged her away toward the big house, as Crowe bellowed for someone to fetch the master, as the other enslaved folks watched with fear and something that might have been pride in their eyes, Harriet felt a strange peace settle over her. She'd fought back. She'd refused to be violated without resistance. She'd bit the hand that whipped her, and though she knew, Lord, how she knew, that she would pay a terrible price, at least she'd struck a blow, however small, against the system that had crushed so many before her. As the sun set that evening, painting the Virginia sky in shades of crimson and gold, Harriet was locked in a shed near the big house, alone with her thoughts and her fears and her certainty that tomorrow would bring suffering beyond imagining. But in her heart, she held on to one truth. They could break her body, but her spirit, her rebellious, unbroken spirit, would never bow complete. And somewhere in the darkness, the ancestors whispered, "Well done, daughter. Well done. Now listen here, child. Before we get to the judgment that was coming for Harriet like a storm rolling across them Virginia hills, I gotta take you back a piece. Back to the days before the bite, so you understand what she was fighting for. What made her spirit so powerful strong that she'd risk everything rather than submit? Life in them slave quarters, Lord of glory, it was a daily crucible of suffering mixed with small mercies, a endless cycle of labor and loss punctuated by moments of grace so precious they'd make you weep just remembering them. The quarters at Wexford Plantation was a collection of ramshackle cabins, mud and timber affairs with roofs that leaked when the rains came heavy, walls that couldn't keep out the winter cold, and floors of packed earth that turned to mud when the weather was wet and dust when it was dry. Each cabin housed anywhere from 6 to 10 souls, all crammed together like sardines in a tin. Privacy was a luxury we couldn't afford, and personal space was something only white folks enjoyed. Harriet shared her cabin with her 2 babies, her cousin Ruth and Ruth's 3 children, and old Uncle Amos, a field hand so ancient his back was permanently bent like a question mark from decades of stooped labor. The day started before the sun thought about rising. The plantation bell would clang at 4 in the morning, that cursed bell, and folks would stumble out of their cabins half asleep, half starved, fully exhausted from the day before. Breakfast, if you could call it that, was a hasty affair. Cornmeal mush cooked in a communal pot, maybe a scrap of salt pork if you was lucky, washed down with water that tasted of iron and dirt. "Mama," little Moses would whimper, rubbing his sleepy eyes as Harriet hurried to get him and Sarah ready for the day. Eyes still hungry, and Harriet's heart went heavy, chest got tight, because what could she say? There wasn't no more food. The rations Massa doled out was barely enough to keep body and soul together, designed to provide just enough sustenance to keep us working, but never enough to give us real strength. "I know, baby," she'd whisper, kissing his forehead, "but you gotta be strong. Eat your mush slow like, make it last. And remember what Grandmama Abini used to say, empty belly, full spirit. The ancestors watching over us, even when we hurtin' something terrible." The children of the quarters, they didn't get no childhood, not really. By age 5 or 6, they was put to work carrying water to the field hands, shooing flies off the tobacco leaves hanging in the drying sheds, or performing endless small tasks that kept the plantation machine running smooth. Harriet would watch her babies head off each morning, little Moses holding Sarah's hand, and she'd pray, oh how she'd pray, that they'd make it through another day without catching the overseer's ire or the patty roller's attention. The work itself was brutal beyond words. In the tobacco fields under that burning sun, that skinning heat that could kill a man dead if he wasn't careful. Harriet and the other field hands would labor from first light till the stars came out. The tobacco plants grew tall as a man, with broad leaves that had to be plucked just right, at just the right time, or you'd catch a whipping for ruining the crop. Your back ached like it carried the weight of the world. Your hands bled from the constant contact with the rough leaves. Your throat burned from breathing in the dust and the smell of the tobacco. And always, always there was the overseer's watchful eye, the crack of the whip in the air like thunder without rain, the constant threat of punishment for the smallest infraction. But folks swear on their lives they seen, even in that hellish daily grind, the human spirit found ways to survive, to resist, to maintain dignity in the face of dehumanization. The songs, sweet Jesus, the songs, they was our lifeline, our connection to something deeper than the suffering. As we worked, we sang. The work songs set a rhythm, made the unbearable just barely bearable, and carried messages the white folks couldn't understand. Wade in the water, children. Wade in the water, God's gonna trouble the water. That wasn't just about baptism, no sir. That was code for runaways to walk in the streams and rivers so the dogs couldn't track they scent. Every spiritual carried hidden meaning. Every hymn was a map to freedom for them that had ears to hear. Swing low, sweet chariot, coming for to carry me home. I looked over Jordan, and what did I see? A band of angels coming after me. The sweet chariot was the Underground Railroad. Jordan was the Ohio River, the border between slavery and freedom. The band of angels was the conductors, brave souls like Harriet Tubman, though she come later in the story of our people's struggle, who risked everything to guide freedom seekers north. In the quiet of the quarters at night, After the work was done and the overseers had retired to their comfortable beds, that's when the real community came alive. Folks would gather in the spaces between the cabins, speaking low so as not to draw attention, sharing what little food they had, tending to each other's wounds, both physical and spiritual. Old Mama Zuri, that powerful, strong conjure woman, would move from cabin to cabin with her basket of roots and herbs, treating sick folk with remedies passed down from Africa through generations. For fever, she'd brew tea from willow bark. For wounds, she'd make poultices of plantain and comfrey. For spiritual protection, she'd prepare mojo bags filled with gopher dust, that mixture of graveyard dirt, sulfur, and salt, tied with red thread and worn close to the heart. "The masters think they got all the power," she'd say, her ancient eyes gleaming in the firelight. "But they don't know nothing about the real power. The power of the ancestors, the power of the spirits, the power that flows through the earth and the water and the air. They can chain our bodies, but our souls fly free every night, crossing back over the dark waters to Africa, communing with them that came before." Harriet believed it too. On the hardest days, when the whip had struck close or hunger gnawed at her belly, or fear for her children kept her awake through the long night, she'd close her eyes and feel the presence of her mama, her daddy, all the ancestors stretching back through time to the shores of Africa. They whispered strength to her, reminded her that she was more than what the masters said she was. But the terror, Lord have mercy, the terror was always present, lurking like a snake in tall grass. The paddy rollers rode regular, especially at night. These was poor white men given authority to police the enslaved population, and they took to their task with enthusiasm born of their own insecurity and hatred. They'd ride through with they dogs and they torches, checking for runaways, beating anyone caught outside without a pass, spreading fear like a disease. One night, Harriet would never forget it long as she lived. The paddy rollers come through the quarters with they bloodhounds, searching for a young man named Samuel who'd run off 3 days prior. Harriet was outside her cabin with Moses and Sarah when she heard the dogs baying, heard the men shouting, saw the torches burning bright against the dark sky. "Get inside," she hissed at her babies, pushing them toward the cabin door. But she wasn't fast enough. One of the dogs, a massive snarling beast trained to hunt human beings, broke free from its handler and came charging straight at little Moses. The boy froze, scared to death, unable to move as the hound bore down on him with teeth bared. In that split second, Harriet didn't think. She just moved. She threw herself between the dog and her son, taking the full force of the animal's attack. The hound's jaws clamped down on her arm, tearing through flesh, and she screamed, a sound of pain and fury that echoed across the quarters. "Get that damn dog off her!" one of the paddy rollers shouted, finally getting control of the animal and yanking it back. But the damage was done. Harriet's arm was torn open, blood flowing like river water, the pain so intense she nearly fainted. The paddy roller looked at her with disgust. "Stupid wench," he spat. "Should have kept your brat inside where he belongs." But Harriet, even through the pain, even with blood pouring from her wound, looked that man straight in the eye with such fierce intensity that he actually stepped back. "That's my child," she said, her voice low and dangerous. "My child, and I'll die before I let harm come to him." After the paddy rollers left, the quarters erupted in activity. Old Mama Zuri came running with her basket of medicines, cleaning Harriet's wound with whiskey that burned worse than fire, then packing it with a poultice of herbs and spider webs, which helped stop the bleeding, she said. "You a fierce one," Mama Zuri said as she worked. "A woman of steel, but you gotta be careful, child. That kind of defiance, it draws attention, and attention from white folks ain't never a good thing for our people." But how could Harriet be anything other than what she was? The root doctor warned her, and she understood the wisdom in them words. But deep in her soul, in that place where the ancestors lived and breathed, she knew she couldn't be broken, couldn't be made to submit complete. In the days that followed, as her arm healed slow and painful, Harriet taught her children everything she knew about survival. She taught Moses and Sarah the spirituals and the secret codes hidden within them. She told them stories about Africa, about freedom, about resistance. She showed him which plants could heal and which could harm, which stars to follow if they ever needed to run, which white folks might help and which ones would kill you soon as look at you. "Mama," little Sarah asked one evening as they sat outside their cabin watching the sunset, "why the white folks so mean to us?" Harriet pulled her daughter close, kissing the top of her head. "I don't know, baby," she said honestly. "I truly don't. But what I do know is this. We ain't what they say we are. We ain't animals or property or less than human. We are children of God, descendants of kings and queens, carriers of wisdom and strength that goes back thousands of years. Don't you never forget that." And when night fell like a curse over the plantation, when the darkness pressed down heavy with fear and uncertainty, Harriet would sing to her babies, soft and low so the overseers wouldn't hear. "Hush, little baby, don't you cry. Mama gonna take you by and by. North star shining, moon up high. One day we gonna touch the sky." That was the weight of daily life, the constant struggle between suffering and survival, between submission and resistance, between despair and hope. Every day was a battle to maintain your humanity in a system designed to strip it away. Every night was a small victory if you made it through alive and intact. And through it all, Harriet held on to one unshakable truth. She would endure. She would resist. She would protect her children with every breath in her body. And if the day ever came when she had to choose between submission and defiance, well, we already know what choice she made, don't we? Gather close now, 'cause this is where the darkness gets deeper, where the suffering becomes almost too much to bear, where the rage that had been simmering in Harriet's soul began to boil over like a pot left too long on the fire. It was late summer of 1844, just about a year before the bite that would change everything. The tobacco crop was coming in strong, and Massa Wexford was pleased as punch, which meant more work for us enslaved folk and maybe, just maybe, slightly better rations come harvest time. But that pleasure didn't trickle down to the overseers, especially not to Silas Crowe, who seemed to take joy only in inflicting misery. The old ones warned us that something was coming. Old Mama Zuri read the signs in nature. Too many crows gathering on the fence posts, the hoot of owls at midday, a red ring round the moon 3 nights running. "Bad omen," she muttered, shaking her ancient head. "Dark sign. The spirit's restless, and when the spirit's restless, blood gonna flow." She was right, as the conjure women usually are. There was an old man in the quarters named Josiah. He'd been enslaved at Wexford since before most of us was born. Must have been near 70 years old, though nobody knew for sure since the masters didn't bother recording birth dates for property. Josiah was one of them that remembered Africa, not firsthand but through his mama's stories, passed down like precious jewels through generations. He moved slow these days, his joints swollen with what Mama Zuri called the bone ache, his back so bent from decades of fieldwork that he couldn't straighten up complete, even if he tried. But Josiah still worked. Had to. There was no retirement for the enslaved, no gentle sunset years. You worked till you dropped dead in the fields, and then they'd bury you in the slave cemetery with no marker, no name, nothing to show you'd ever existed, except the memories carried by them that loved you. That particular morning started like any other. The cursed bell rang at 4, and we stumbled out into the pre-dawn darkness, bellies grumbling, bodies aching from the day before. The air hung heavy and thick, the kind of oppressive humidity that makes every breath feel like drowning, that makes sweat pour off you before you even start working. Josiah was moving especially slow that day. Harriet could see it, the way he winced with each step, the way his hands trembled as he tried to grip the tobacco leaves, the way he had to stop every few minutes just to catch his breath. "Uncle Josiah," she whispered during one of these pauses, "you shouldn't be out here today. You need rest." The old man smiled, a sad, weary smile that spoke of resignation and acceptance. "Child," he said, his voice crackling like dry leaves, "the day I stop working is the day they put me in the ground. And I ain't quite ready for that yet. The ancestors ain't called me home. But Silas Crowe, that devil's man, that cruel overseer, he had no patience for weakness, no mercy for age or infirmity. He come riding through the rows on his big bay horse, whip in hand, eyes scanning for any sign of slowness or laziness. As he called it, though there wasn't nothing lazy about folks working themselves to death under a brutal sun. When he spotted Josiah moving at his reduced pace, Crowe's face twisted into that familiar expression of contempt and rage. "You!" he bellowed, pointing his whip at the old man. "What the hell you think you doing, moving like molasses in January? You trying to cheat Massa out of his profit?" Josiah straightened up as best he could, which wasn't much. "No, sir, Massa Crowe," he said, his voice respectful but strained. "I's working fast as I can. These old bones just don't move like they used to." Crowe dismounted, staggering slightly. He'd been drinking already, though it wasn't even mid-morning yet. The smell of whiskey on his breath mixed with the smell of tobacco and sweat and hatred. "Old bones?" he sneered. "You think Massa care about your old bones? You think I care? You work at the pace I set, or you don't work at all. And if you don't work..." He cracked the whip in the air, the sound like a gunshot echoing across the field. Harriet watched this unfold from 2 rows over, felt her heart beating like African drums, felt the rage rising in her throat like bile. She'd seen this before, the way Crowe would single out the weakest, the most vulnerable, the ones who couldn't fight back, and make examples of them. "Please, sir," Josiah said, and there was dignity in his voice even as he pleaded. "I's doing my best. Just give me a moment to catch my breath." But mercy wasn't in Silas Crowe's vocabulary. He grabbed Josiah by the collar of his ragged shirt and dragged him, literally dragged him like a sack of grain, toward the edge of the field where an old whipping tree stood, its branches scarred from years of holding ropes that bound folks for punishment. "No!" The cry came from Harriet before she could stop herself. She dropped her basket of tobacco leaves and started moving toward them, but other hands grabbed her. Ruth, her cousin, holding her back with surprising strength. "Don't," Ruth hissed in her ear. "Don't get involved, Harriet. You got babies to think about. You can't help him." But Harriet struggled against her cousin's grip, watched in horror as Crowe tied Josiah's wrists to the tree, ripping away the old man's shirt to expose his back. Already a landscape of scars from a lifetime of whippings, some old and faded, some more recent and still raised. "Let this be a lesson," Crowe shouted to the assembled field hands, all of whom had stopped working to watch this latest atrocity. "This is what happens to lazy darkies who think they can set their own pace." The first lash fell. Josiah cried out, a sound of pure agony that seemed to echo off the very heavens themselves. The second lash, the third. By the 5th, Josiah had stopped crying out and just hung there, supported only by the ropes binding his wrists, his old body unable to endure this brutal assault. Harriet felt something break inside her. She stopped struggling against Ruth's grip and just stood there, tears streaming down her face, hands clenched into fists so tight her nails drew blood from her palms. She wanted to scream, wanted to run at Crowe and tear him apart with her bare hands, wanted to call down curses from the ancestors upon his evil head. But she was paralyzed, caught between the desire to act and the knowledge that any action would mean her own death and the probable sale or murder of her children. The whipping continued, 10 lashes, 15, 20. Somewhere around the 25th lash, Josiah's body went completely limp. One of the other field hands, a man named Elijah, called out, "Massa Crowe, I think he done passed out." But Crowe, drunk on whiskey and power and pure evil, just laughed. "He ain't passed out," he said, delivering another vicious strike. "He just faking to get me to stop. Well, it ain't gonna work." 5 more lashes fell on flesh that could no longer feel him. Finally, Crowe stopped, breathing hard from the exertion, his face flushed red. He walked around to look at Josiah's face and suddenly went still. "Well, hell," he muttered. "Old fool done went and died on me." The silence that followed was absolute. Even the birds stopped singing. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. Josiah, kind, gentle Josiah who remembered Africa through his mama's stories, who sang the old songs in a language the white folks couldn't understand, who'd survived 70 years of bondage, was dead, beaten to death for the crime of being old and slow. Crowe cut him down without ceremony, and the body fell to the ground like a dropped sack. He looked at the assembled field hands with cold eyes. "Get back to work," he ordered, "and let this be a warning to all you lazy darkies. I don't care how old you are, how tired you are, how sick you are. You work at my pace or you end up like this worthless old fool." That night carried heavy spirits, I tell you. The quarters was wrapped in a grief so thick you could almost touch it. They laid Josiah's body out in the praise house, and folks come to pay respects, to sing the spirituals over him, to mourn not just his passing, but the brutal way he was taken from this world. Harriet sat in her cabin, unable to cry anymore, all cried out. Her babies was asleep, but she couldn't rest. The rage inside her had grown from a spark to a flame, and that flame was threatening to consume her from the inside out. Old Mama Zuri come to visit, her ancient face grave and troubled in mind. "I know what you feelin', child," she said, sitting beside Harriet in the darkness. "I seen that look in your eyes. That's the look of someone ready to do something desperate." Harriet's voice, when she spoke, was hard as iron. "How much more, Mama Zuri?" she asked. "How much more can we endure? They killed Josiah today for nothing, for being old, for being tired. They beat us, they sell our families, they use our bodies however they please. When does it stop? When do we say enough?" The old conjure woman was quiet for a long moment, and when she finally spoke, her words carried weight of centuries. "The fire gonna rise," she said. "It always does, eventually. But fire burns them that set it as well as them it's meant to destroy. You gotta ask yourself, are you ready to pay that price? Are you ready to sacrifice everything, maybe even your babies, for a moment of resistance?" Harriet looked at her sleeping children, her heart torn in two directions. "I don't know," she whispered. "God help me, I don't know." But over the following weeks, something shifted in Harriet. She worked harder than ever, but it wasn't out of submission. It was out of determination to survive, to get stronger, to prepare for something. She didn't know what yet, but she could feel it coming like a storm on the horizon. She started having dreams, powerful, vivid visions that seemed more real than waking life. In these dreams, she followed the drink-and-gourd star north across rivers and through forests, guided by ancestors who walked beside her in spirit form. She dreamed of freedom, could almost taste it sweet as honey on her tongue, but she also dreamed of the consequences of seeking that freedom. She saw her children sold away, screaming for her as they was dragged to the auction block. She saw herself caught by paddy rollers, torn apart by they dogs. She saw the whipping post and the rope, and the endless, bottomless suffering that awaited them that dared to resist. One night, maybe 3 months after Josiah's murder, Harriet was awakened by a sound outside her cabin. She rose carefully, not waking the babies, and peered through the cracks in the walls. It was Silas Crowe, drunk as a lord, stumbling between the cabins with a torch in one hand and a bottle in the other. He was singing, if you could call it that, some vulgar song, his voice slurred and ugly in the darkness. And then he stopped, right in front of Harriet's cabin. Her blood ran cold. She held her breath, praying he'd move on, praying he wouldn't notice her watching. But he did notice. Their eyes met through the crack in the wall, and even in his drunken state, she saw the recognition dawn in his face. Saw something else too, a hunger, a desire, a threat. "Well, well," he slurred, "if it ain't Harriet, strong, defiant Harriet." He took a step toward the cabin door. Harriet moved quick, grabbing the only weapon she had, a piece of firewood from beside the cold hearth. She positioned herself between Crowe and her sleeping babies, her heart pounding but her resolve iron strong. But Crowe didn't come in, not that night. Instead, he just stood there swaying slightly, that evil grin on his face. "You and me," he said, his voice carrying a promise and a threat. "We gonna have our time together real soon. I's been watching you, girl, been thinking about you, and what Silas Crowe wants, Silas Crowe takes." Then he laughed, a sound like gravel in a tin can, and stumbled away into the darkness. Harriet didn't sleep the rest of that night. She sat with her back against the cabin wall, the piece of firewood across her lap, watching the door, protecting her children, and feeling the rage inside her grow hotter and hotter. The next morning, she went to old Mama Zuri. "I need protection," she said. "Strong protection, the kind that'll keep evil away from me and mine." The conjure woman looked at her with knowing eyes. "You talking about Crowe?" she said. It wasn't a question. Harriet nodded. Mama Zuri was quiet for a moment, then she reached into her basket and pulled out a small cloth bag, already prepared, like she'd been expecting this request. "This here's a powerful mojo bag," she said. "Got gopher dust, graveyard dirt from the crossroads mixed with sulfur, salt, and crushed bones from a black cat. Got High John the Conqueror root for strength, and a piece of iron from a horseshoe for protection. You wear this close to your heart, and it'll shield you from evil intentions." She pressed the bag into Harriet's hand. "But understand something, child," Mama Zuri continued, her voice grave. "Protection magic only goes so far. It can deflect, it can delay. But if a man like Crowe is determined, well, magic can't stop a whip or prevent a master from selling you. What it can do is strengthen your spirit, give you courage when the time comes to fight back." "And when that time comes," Harriet asked, her voice steady, "will the ancestors stand with me?" Mama Zuri smiled, a sad, knowing smile. "Child, the ancestors been standing with us since the first of our people was dragged onto them slave ships. They suffered what we suffer. They know our pain, and when you strike your blow and I can see in your eyes that you will strike a blow someday, they'll be there, giving you strength." That very afternoon, the threat Crowe had made became more explicit. He cornered Harriet at the edge of the tobacco field, away from prying eyes, and grabbed her arm, the same arm the patty roller's dog had torn months before. "Listen here, wench," he said, his breath hot and reeking of whiskey. "I'm done playing games with you. Come Friday night when the moon's dark, you're gonna meet me in the tobacco shed. You're gonna give me what I want, or I'm gonna tell Massa you've been stealing food from the big house. You know what happens to thieves?" Harriet did know. They was whipped severe, sometimes branded, sometimes sold away south where conditions was even worse than here, if such a thing was possible. "And if you think about running," Crowe continued, his grip on her arm tightening till she thought the bone might snap, "remember I know where your little brats sleep. Accidents happen to children all the time on plantations, falls from the hayloft, drownings in the creek, snake bites. Would be a shame if something happened to that pretty little girl of yours." The threat to her children, that was the line that couldn't be crossed. Harriet felt the mojo bag burn against her chest like a hot coal, felt the ancestors stir in her blood, felt a clarity descend upon her like a divine revelation. She looked Silas Crowe straight in his pale, evil eyes and made a decision. She didn't say nothing, didn't give him the satisfaction of a response. She just nodded slightly, let him think she was submitting, accepting his vile proposition. "That's a good girl," he said, releasing her arm. "Friday night, don't forget." As he walked away, Harriet touched the mojo bag through her dress and whispered a promise, not to Crowe, but to herself, to her ancestors, to every enslaved soul that had ever suffered under this evil system. "I won't forget. And when Friday comes, one way or another, this ends." She didn't know yet exactly what she would do. She didn't have a plan, not really. But she knew with absolute certainty that she would not submit to Crowe's violation. She would fight. She would resist. And if that resistance cost her everything, her freedom, her life, maybe even her children's safety, well, some things was worth dying for. That night she dreamed again of the North Star, bright and constant in the sky. But this time, the dream was different. The star wasn't just a guide to freedom, it was a witness. It watched and waited to see what choice she would make. And in her dream, she heard the voice of her mama, dead these 4 years but still present in spirit. "Daughter, they can break your body, but they cannot break your will. Stand firm. The ancestors are with you. And remember, Sometimes the bravest thing you can do is simply refuse to bow. When Harriet woke, tears streaming down her face, she knew what she had to do. Friday was 3 days away. 3 days to prepare, to pray, to gather her courage. 3 days before the confrontation that would change everything. The spark of rage that had been kindled by Josiah's murder, that had been fanned by Crowe's threats, was now a full flame. And come Friday night, that flame would either light the way to a new future or consume her entirely. Either way, Harriet was done being a victim. She was ready to be a warrior. Lord have mercy. Now we come to the part of the story that's hard to tell, hard to hear, hard to carry in your heart. But it gotta be told, 'cause this is the truth of what our women endured. The violence that wasn't just whips and chains, but the violation of body and soul that left scars no poultice could heal. Friday came like death riding a pale horse. The day dragged on eternal like, each minute stretching into an hour, each hour into a lifetime. Harriet worked in the tobacco fields with her mind far away, running through possibilities, prayers, and desperate plans. The mojo bag old Mama Zuri had given her burned against her chest like a live coal, reminding her that the ancestors was watching, that she wasn't alone in this fight. The other women in the quarters knew something was wrong. They could see it in Harriet's eyes, in the set of her shoulders, in the way she held herself like a bowstring pulled too tight, ready to snap. Her cousin Ruth tried to get her to talk during the brief noon break, when they huddled in the shade of an oak tree, gulping down water that tasted of iron and earth. "Harriet," Ruth whispered, her voice heavy-hearted, "you got that look about you. That look that says trouble coming. What's going on?" But Harriet just shook her head, unable to speak of it. How could she explain the choice she faced? How could she put into words the violation threatening to descend upon her come nightfall, or the decision she'd made to resist, no matter the cost? "Pray for me," was all she said. "Just pray for me, sister." As the sun began its descent, painting the Virginia sky in shades of blood and fire, seemed like an omen, seemed like the heavens themselves knew what was coming. Harriet made her preparations. She fed Moses and Sarah their meager supper of cornmeal mush, held them close longer than usual, breathing in the sweet smell of their hair, memorizing the feel of their small bodies in her arms. "Mama," little Moses said, looking up at her with those wide, trusting eyes, "why you crying?" She hadn't realized tears was falling down her face. She wiped them away quick-like. "I ain't crying, baby," she lied. "Just got some dust in my eyes from the fields." But Sarah, even at just 2 years old, seemed to sense something was wrong. She clung to Harriet's skirt, whimpering soft-like, refusing to let go. "Shh," Harriet whispered, holding her daughter tight. "Mama's here. Mama's always gonna be here one way or another. You remember that, you hear? No matter what happens, Mama loves you more than life itself." She settled the children to sleep early, singing to them in a voice that trembled despite her efforts to keep it steady. "Hush, little baby, don't say a word. Mama gonna sing you a mockingbird. And if that mockingbird don't sing, Mama gonna find you a golden ring." When they finally drifted off, she sat watching them in the dim light of the cabin, memorizing every detail of their faces. Moses had her mama Abini's strong features. Sarah had the gentle curve of her daddy Jacob's brow. They was beautiful, precious, worth more than all the tobacco in Virginia, worth more than freedom itself. But if she didn't resist Crowe, if she allowed herself to be violated without fighting back, what kind of example would that set for her daughter? What kind of man would Moses grow up to be if he learned that his mama had submitted without resistance? No, some things was worth fighting for, even if that fight meant losing everything. Old Mama Zuri came to the cabin just as full darkness fell. She brought with her a small clay jar filled with a pungent salve. "This here's for protection," she said, her ancient voice grave and troubled. "You rub this on your skin, wrists, neck, anywhere he might touch. It got roots in it that'll make you strong, give you courage. Won't stop what's coming, but it'll help you endure." Harriet took the jar, but she had no intention of enduring. She had something else in mind. "Mama Zuri," she said quietly, "if something happens to me tonight, will you watch over Moses and Sarah? Will you make sure they remember who I was, not just what the white folks say about me?" The old conjure woman's eyes filled with tears, a rare thing for someone who'd seen as much suffering as she had. "Child," she said, reaching out to cup Harriet's face with her gnarled hand, "you got the spirit of warriors in you. Your ancestors walking with you tonight. Whatever happens, know that you fought. Know that you didn't bow your head complete. And yes, if it comes to it, I'll watch over your babies like they was my own." After Mama Zuri left, Harriet sat alone in the darkness, waiting. The tobacco shed where Crowe had ordered her to meet him was maybe 200 yards from the quarters, near the edge of the plantation where the fields met the woods. It was isolated, hidden from view, the perfect place for violence to unfold unseen. Just before the appointed hour, Harriet rose. She touched the mojo bag one last time, whispering a prayer to the ancestors. Then she slipped out of the cabin into the night. The moon was dark, just like Crowe had said it would be. The only light came from stars scattered across the sky like diamonds on black velvet. The North Star, that drinking gourd, shone bright and constant, a reminder that somewhere beyond this darkness, freedom existed. Her footsteps made no sound as she moved through the quarters. She could hear snoring from some cabins, quiet sobbing from others, the whispered prayers of folk seeking comfort from the only source available to them, faith in a God who seemed to have abandoned them to this hell. The tobacco shed loomed ahead, its dark bulk silhouetted against the slightly lighter sky. The door stood open, and inside, a single lantern burned with weak, flickering light. Harriet paused at the threshold, her heart beating like African drums, every instinct screaming at her to run, to flee into the woods and take her chances with the paddy rollers and the dogs, rather than face what waited inside. But she'd made a promise to herself. She wouldn't run, she wouldn't hide. She would face this head on, and whatever happened, she'd go down fighting. She stepped inside. Silas Crowe was there, waiting. He'd been drinking heavy. She could smell the whiskey on him from across the shed. He leaned against a wooden post, a bottle in one hand, that evil grin on his face. "Well, well," he slurred. "I was starting to think you wasn't gonna show. Thought maybe you'd decided to run, and I'd have to make good on my threats about them brats of yours." Harriet said nothing. She just stood there, every muscle in her body tense, ready. Crowe pushed off from the post and stumbled toward her. In the weak lantern light, his face looked demonic, shadows dancing across his features, turning him into something less than human. "You know what I want," he said, reaching out to touch her face. That's when Harriet moved. Quick as a snake strike, she slapped his hand away. "Don't touch me," she said, her voice low and dangerous. Crowe's face darkened with rage. The smile disappeared, replaced by something cold and cruel. "You forgettin' your place, girl," he said. "You don't tell me what to do. I own you, Massa owns you. Your body ain't yours, it belongs to us to do with as we please." He lunged forward, grabbing her arms with brutal strength, his fingers digging into her flesh hard enough to leave bruises. The smell of him, whiskey and sweat and tobacco and hatred filled her nostrils, making her stomach turn. Harriet struggled, but he was stronger. He pushed her back against the wall of the shed, pinning her there with his body weight. His hands roamed where they had no right to go, violating, claiming, taking what he thought was his by right of his position and her status as property. "No!" Harriet screamed, bucking against him, trying to break free. "Get off me!" But Crowe just laughed, that terrible sound like gravel in a tin can. "Scream all you want," he said. "Ain't nobody gonna help you. They all know better than to interfere with white folks' business." In that moment, Harriet felt something inside her shatter. All the rage, all the pain, all the centuries of oppression and violation that our people had endured came rushing up like a flood. She stopped struggling and went still, letting Crowe think she'd given up. He relaxed slightly, his grip loosening just a fraction. That's when she struck. Her knee came up hard and fast, catching him square between the legs. Crowe howled in pain, staggering backward, and Harriet used that moment to slip free. She grabbed the first thing her hands found, a wooden tobacco stake leaning against the wall, and swung it with all her strength. The stake connected with Crowe's shoulder, not hard enough to seriously injure, but enough to send him sprawling to the ground, the whiskey bottle flying from his hand and shattering against the floor. For a moment they just stared at each other, Crowe on the ground, clutching his shoulder and his groin, his face a mask of shock and fury. Harriet standing over him with the stake raised, breathing hard, her body shaken with adrenaline and terror and triumph. You hit me," Crowe gasped as if he couldn't believe what had just happened. "You goddamn struck me. And I'll do it again if you come near me," Harriet said, her voice steady despite her shaken hands. "I ain't your plaything. I ain't nobody's property to be used and discarded. I'm a human being made in God's image same as you, and I won't be violated without fighting back." Crowe started to rise, murder in his eyes, and Harriet knew with absolute certainty that this was it. She'd crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. Whether she ran or stayed, whether she fought or surrendered, her fate was sealed. But then, voices outside. Footsteps approaching. Someone had heard the commotion. Crowe heard it too. He looked at Harriet with eyes full of rage and something else, a promise of retribution. "This ain't over," he hissed. "Not by a long shot. You just signed your own death warrant, and your children's too." Then he stumbled out of the shed, clutching his injured shoulder, disappearing into the darkness before whoever was coming could see him. Harriet dropped the stake and collapsed to her knees, her whole body shaken so hard she thought she might fall apart. She'd fought back. She'd resisted. But at what cost? Old Mama Zuri appeared in the doorway, her ancient face illuminated by the flickering lantern light. "Child," she said softly, kneeling beside Harriet. "I felt the spirit stirring. Knew something terrible was happening. Did he?" "No," Harriet whispered. "I fought him off, but Mama Zuri, what have I done? He gonna kill me now, gonna kill my babies." The old woman pulled Harriet close, rocking her like a child. "You did what you had to do," she said. "You stood up. You refused to be broken. And yes, there'll be consequences, terrible consequences. But your soul is still yours, child, your dignity intact, and sometimes that's all we got." As they sat there in that tobacco shed, surrounded by the smell of dried leaves and spilled whiskey and fear, Harriet knew that everything had changed. The spark of rage had become a flame, and that flame would either burn away the chains or consume her entirely. Either way, there was no going back. Now you see, people, we come to the moment that would echo through the quarters for generations. The act of defiance that would seal Harriet's fate and inspire countless others. Listen close, 'cause this is where everything came to a head, where all that rage and pain and suffering finally found its release in one desperate, primal act of resistance. After that night in the tobacco shed, things moved fast and strange. Crowe didn't report what had happened right away. Couldn't without admitting he'd tried to violate Harriet, which even in that time and place carried some shame among certain white folks. But his rage simmered like a pot ready to boil over, and everybody in the quarters could feel it. He watched Harriet with eyes full of murder and malice. Everywhere she went, there he was, riding past her section of the field more often, finding excuses to inspect her work, speaking to her in a voice dripping with threat and promise of retribution. "Your time comin'," he'd whisper as he passed. "You and them brats, your time comin' real soon." Harriet lived in a state of constant terror, knowing that Crowe was just waiting for the right moment to strike. She barely slept, starting at every sound, her hand always reaching for that mojo bag that hung around her neck. Old Mama Zuri kept her supplied with protective charms and strengthening tonics, but they both knew that magic could only do so much against a man consumed by hatred and the power to act on it. The breaking point came on a sweltering August day in 1845, a day so hot the very air seemed to shimmer like water, so oppressive that breathing felt like drowning in liquid fire. The tobacco fields stretched endlessly under that burning sun, that skinning heat that could kill a soul dead if they wasn't careful. Harriet had been working since before dawn, her back aching something terrible, her hands blistered and bleeding from the rough leaves. Sweat poured down her face, mixing with the dust till she was covered in a layer of red-brown mud. Her throat burned from thirst. The water barrel was nearly empty, and Crowe had forbidden anyone from refetching it till the quota was met. Around midday, when the sun reached its peak and the heat became near unbearable, Harriet felt herself swaying on her feet. Her vision blurred, and she had to pause just for a moment to catch her breath and steady herself. That's when she heard it. The sound of hoofbeats approaching, the creak of leather, the jingle of a whip being uncoiled. Silas Crowe. He rode up beside her, his face red and sweaty, his eyes bloodshot from whiskey even this early in the day. He'd been drinking more than usual lately, probably nursing his wounded pride along with his wounded shoulder and groin. "What the hell you think you doing standing there like you on vacation?" he barked. "You think massa pay good money for lazy wenches who can't keep up?" Harriet straightened up as best she could, her muscles screaming in protest. "I's just catching my breath, sir," she said, keeping her voice respectful despite the rage boiling in her belly. "It's powerful hot today." "I don't give a damn how hot it is," Crowe snarled, dismounting from his horse. "You work till I say you can rest. You understand me?" He moved closer, and Harriet could smell the whiskey on his breath, see the cruelty in his eyes. This was it. She knew it in her bones. He'd been waiting for an excuse, any excuse, to punish her for what happened in the tobacco shed. "Now get back to work," he said, his hand moving to his whip, "or I'll give you something to really complain about." Harriet turned to resume her labor, her heart pounding, praying that he'd just leave her be. But Crowe wasn't done. He reached out and grabbed her arm, the same arm the patty roller's dog had torn, the same arm he'd bruised in the tobacco shed, and yanked her around to face him. "Matter of fact," he said, his voice dropping to that dangerous purr she'd heard before, "I think you need a reminder of your place. You've been acting mighty uppity lately, and it's time somebody taught you a lesson." He raised his whip. In that split second, Harriet saw her whole life flash before her eyes. She saw her mama Abini worked to death in these very fields. She saw her daddy sold away before she could remember his face. She saw old Josiah beaten to death for being slow. She saw the Middle Passage survivors chained in the bellies of ships, drowning in their own waste. She saw generations of her people enslaved, violated, murdered, and she felt their rage and pain course through her veins like liquid fire. And she thought of her babies, Moses and Sarah, and what kind of world they'd grow up in if folks like her just kept submitting, kept bowing their heads, kept accepting the unacceptable. "No," she said. The word came out quiet but firm. Crowe froze, the whip raised but not yet fallen. "What did you say?" "I said no," Harriet repeated louder this time. "I ain't done nothing wrong. I don't deserve to be whipped." The other field hands nearby stopped working, frozen in shock and fear. Nobody talked back to an overseer. Nobody refused a whipping. It just wasn't done. Crowe's face went from red to purple, veins bulging in his forehead. "You don't get to decide what you deserve," he hissed. "You're property. You're a thing. And when I say you get whipped, you get whipped." He brought the whip down. But Harriet moved. Fast as a snake strike, she twisted away, and the lash that should have opened her back instead caught only air. Crowe, off balance and drunk, stumbled forward, and Harriet used that moment to grab his arm, the one holding the whip. They struggled, locked together in a deadly dance, Crowe trying to free his whip hand, Harriet holding on with desperate strength. He was bigger, stronger, but she had something he didn't. She had nothing left to lose. "Let go, you damn wench," he bellowed, raising his other hand to strike her across the face. But as his hand came up, as his fingers curled into a fist, Harriet saw the opening. Without thinking, without planning, purely on instinct and fury and the accumulated rage of her entire existence, she lunged forward and sank her teeth into his hand. She bit down hard. She bit with all the strength in her jaws, felt her teeth pierce skin and muscle, tasted blood, bitter and metallic, the blood of her oppressor flowing into her mouth. Crowe screamed, a high-pitched wail of agony that echoed across the tobacco fields like the cry of a wounded animal. He tried to pull away, but Harriet held on like a dog with a bone, like a woman possessed by the spirits of all who'd suffered before her. "Get off! Get off me, you crazy animal!" Finally, He wrenched his hand free, staggering backward, clutching the wounded appendage. Deep tooth marks were visible in the flesh, blood welling up and dripping onto the red clay soil. For a moment there was absolute silence. Even the birds stopped singing. Even the wind held its breath. Harriet stood there, blood on her lips, her eyes blazing with defiant fire. Around her, the other enslaved folks watched in horror and awe. Horror at what she'd done. Awe at her courage. She'd bit the hand that whipped her. She'd struck back at the overseer. She'd crossed every line, broken every rule, defied every expectation of how an enslaved woman should behave. And she knew, oh Lord, how she knew, that there would be terrible consequences. Crowe looked at his bleeding hand, then at Harriet, then back at his hand, as if he couldn't quite believe what had just happened. His face contorted with rage and pain and something that might have been fear, because in that moment, he'd seen something in Harriet's eyes that terrified him, an absolute refusal to be broken. "You," he gasped, "you bit me. You filthy, savage animal, you bit me." By now, other overseers were riding over, drawn by Crowe's screams. Field hands from neighboring sections had stopped work to stare. Even from a distance, folks from the quarters could see something momentous was happening. One of the other overseers, a man named Pritchard, dismounted and grabbed Harriet, twisting her arms behind her back and binding her wrists with rope. She didn't resist. There was no point. She'd made her stand, struck her blow, and now she'd face whatever came next. "Get her to the big house," Crowe ordered, his voice shaking with fury. "And fetch Massa. This wench just assaulted me. Bit me like a rabid dog. She gonna pay for this." "Oh yes, she gonna pay, dear." As they dragged Harriet away, her feet barely touching the ground, she turned her head and looked back at the assembled field hands. In their eyes, she saw fear. Yes, but also something else. Pride. Hope. Recognition that someone had finally fought back, even knowing the cost. And in that moment, despite the terror of what awaited her, despite knowing she'd probably never see her children again, despite the certainty of punishment beyond imagination, Harriet felt a strange peace settle over her. She'd refused to bow complete. She'd bit the hand that whipped her. And though the price would be terrible, her spirit remained unbroken. As they hauled her toward the big house, she heard it. Soft at first, then growing louder. The field hands had begun to sing, their voices rising in a spiritual that carried coded messages of resistance and hope. "Go down, Moses, way down in Egypt land. Tell old Pharaoh, let my people go." The ancestors were watching, the spirits were stirring, and Harriet's act of defiance, though it would cost her dearly, had planted a seed that would one day grow into a mighty tree of freedom. Sweet Jesus. Now we come to the part where justice, white man's justice, that twisted, poisonous thing, shows its true face. They dragged Harriet to the big house like she was some kind of wild beast caught in a trap. Her wrists bound so tight the rope cut into her flesh, blood trickling down her fingers to drip onto the red clay path. The big house loomed ahead like a white ghost against the afternoon sky. 2 stories of pristine painted wood and columns, built on the backs of enslaved labor, maintained by enslaved hands, a monument to wealth stolen from black bodies. Harriet had never been inside before. Field hands didn't enter the master's domain except under the most extreme circumstances, and this, Lord of Glory, this was about as extreme as it got. They hauled her up the back steps, past the kitchen where enslaved cooks labored over hot stoves, through a narrow hallway that smelled of beeswax and privilege, and finally into what must have been Massa Wexford's study. It was a room full of books, more books than Harriet had ever seen in her life, leather-bound volumes lining the walls from floor to ceiling, a massive desk of polished mahogany, paintings of stern-faced white ancestors staring down from gilt frames. Massa Wexford himself sat behind that desk, a portly man in his 50s with mutton-chop whiskers and cold blue eyes that looked at Harriet the way you'd look at a broken tool, with annoyance at the inconvenience. His wife, the mistress, stood by the window, her face pale and pinched, a lace handkerchief pressed to her nose like the very sight of Harriet offended her delicate sensibilities. Silas Crowe was there too, of course, his wounded hand wrapped in a bloody cloth. his face still purple with rage. Two other overseers flanked the door, blocking any chance of escape. Not that Harriet had any intention of running. Where would she go? Her babies was still in the quarters and she wouldn't leave them behind. "Well," Massa Wexford said, his voice cold and measured. "What have we here, Crowe? You say this wench attacked you?" "Attacked ain't a strong enough word, sir," Crowe spat, holding up his bandaged hand. "The savage bit me. Like a rabid animal, she sank her teeth into my flesh. Look at it. Deep wounds. Could get infected. Could cost me my hand." The Massa's eyebrows rose slightly, the closest thing to surprise his controlled features would allow. "Bit you?" he repeated. "Most irregular. Harriet, is it?" "Yes, I remember you. One of the field hands. Strong worker, if I recall. No history of trouble before this." He looked at her with those cold eyes. "What do you have to say for yourself, girl? Why would you do such a barbarous thing?" Harriet stood there, her body aching from the rough treatment, her mouth still tasting of Crowe's blood, bitter and metallic on her tongue. For a moment, she considered staying silent. What was the point of defending herself? In this world, in this system, an enslaved woman's word meant nothing against a white man's accusation. But then she felt it. That presence she'd carried with her all these days, all these months. The mojo bag against her chest seemed to pulse with warmth, and she heard them, the ancestors, whispering in her blood. "Speak. Speak your truth. Even if they don't listen, even if it changes nothing. Speak. Let it be known that you had a voice, that you refused to be silent." So Harriet lifted her head, looked Massa Wexford straight in the eye, and spoke words that would echo through the quarters for generations to come. "He tried to violate me," she said, her voice steady as stone despite her fear. "First in the tobacco shed, then again today in the fields. He grabbed me, put his hands on me where no man got a right to touch a woman against her will. I fought back. I defended myself. And yes, sir, I bit his hand when he raised it to strike me. I ain't sorry for it neither." The silence that followed was deafening. The mistress gasped, clutching her handkerchief tighter. Massa Wexford's face remained impassive, but something flickered in his eyes. Not sympathy, never that, but perhaps a flicker of discomfort at having the ugly truth spoken aloud. Crowe's face went from purple to nearly black with rage. "She's lying," he roared. "Lying like the devil himself. I never touched her improper. I was just doing my job, keeping her in line when she got lazy. This is what happens when you let these darkies get uppity, when you treat them too soft." "Too soft?" Harriet couldn't help herself. The words burst out before she could stop them. "You call working us from can see to can't see soft? You call whipping old Josiah to death for being slow soft? You call tearing families apart at the auction block soft?" One of the overseers at the door moved forward, raising his hand to strike her. But Massa Wexford held up a hand. "Wait," he said. Then to Harriet, "You dare speak to your betters in such a tone? You forget your place completely?" Harriet felt the rage building in her chest like a fire stoked too hot. "My place," she said, her voice rising. "My place is as a human being made in God's image, same as you. My place is as a mother protecting her children. My place is as a woman who won't be violated without fighting back. That's my place. And if that makes me uppity in your eyes, then so be it." The room erupted. The mistress cried out in shock. Crowe lunged forward, murder in his eyes, but the other overseers grabbed him. Massa Wexford stood, his face finally showing emotion. Anger, yes, but also something else. Fear. Because in that moment, he'd seen something that terrified every slaveholder. An enslaved person who'd stopped pretending, who'd torn away the mask of submission and revealed the human being underneath. Angry, defiant, unbroken. "Enough!" Massa Wexford barked. "This has gone far enough. Crowe, wait outside. I'll deal with you later. As for you..." He turned to Harriet and his eyes was cold as a winter grave. "You've committed the gravest offense an enslaved person can commit. You've struck a white man. You've shown defiance and insubordination of the highest order. And worse, you've spoken sedition. dangerous ideas that could spread to the other slaves like a plague. He walked around his desk, standing before Harriet, towering over her bound form. "I could have you hanged," he said quietly. "The law would support it. You attacked an overseer. That's a capital offense in Virginia. I could string you up from that old oak by the quarters and let you twist in the wind till the crows pick your bones clean." Harriet met his gaze, unflinching. "Then do it," she said. "At least I'll die with my dignity intact. At least my children will know their mama didn't bow her head complete." Massa Wexford studied her for a long moment, and Harriet could see the calculations running behind his eyes. She was valuable property, a strong worker, a proven breeder with 2 healthy children who'd one day add to his labor force. Killing her outright would be wasting an investment, but she'd also become dangerous. Her defiance, if left unpunished, could inspire others. The whole system of slavery depended on fear and submission. One person refusing to bow could shake the foundations of the entire institution. "No," he finally said, "I won't hang you. That would be too merciful, too quick. Instead, you will be made an example of. You will suffer a punishment so severe, so visible, that every slave on this plantation, every slave in the county, will understand the consequences of defiance." He turned to one of the overseers. "Build a platform in the yard between the big house and the quarters. A stage where everyone can see. Tomorrow at noon, when the sun is highest, you will bring every slave on this plantation to witness Harriet's punishment." "And what will that punishment be, you ask?" He looked at Crowe, who'd returned to the doorway, his face eager and cruel. "Crowe, you said she bit you like an animal? Then we'll take away the tools of that bite. Every tooth in her mouth, pulled out one by one with pincers in full view of her people. Let them see what happens when you bite the hand that feeds you. Let them hear her screams and remember, this is the price of resistance." The mistress gasped again, but this time with something that might have been excitement rather than horror. "Evil takes many forms, and sometimes it wears silk dresses and carries lace handkerchiefs." Harriet felt her knees go weak, but she refused to fall. She refused to give them the satisfaction of seeing her collapse. "You a devil," she whispered. "You all devils. But you can take my teeth, you can take my body, you can even take my life, but you can't take my soul. That belongs to God and my ancestors, and you got no claim on it." "Take her away," Massa Wexford said, already turning back to his desk, dismissing her like she was nothing more than an unpleasant task completed. "Lock her in the shed by the whipping post. Give her no food, no water. Let her spend the night contemplating what tomorrow will bring." As they dragged Harriet from the big house, she caught a glimpse through the window of the quarters in the distance. Somewhere in one of those cabins, Moses and Sarah was waiting for their mama to come home. They didn't know yet what had happened, didn't understand that they might never see her again, at least not the way she was now. Old Mama Zuri would tell them, she knew, would explain in whatever way an ancient conjure woman could explain such horror to innocent children, would hold them when they cried, sing them the songs of survival and resistance. The shed they locked her in was small and dark, barely bigger than a coffin stood on end. It smelled of old blood and fear. How many others had been held here before their punishments? How many had stood in this darkness praying for deliverance that never came? But Harriet didn't pray for deliverance. Instead, she prayed for strength. She prayed that when tomorrow came, when they pulled her teeth one by one in front of her people, she wouldn't scream. She wouldn't give the white folks that satisfaction. She prayed that her children would remember her not as broken, but as fierce. She prayed that her act of defiance would plant seeds that would one day grow into a mighty tree of freedom. And as night fell like a curse over Wexford Plantation, as the darkness pressed in from all sides, Harriet heard it. Soft at first, then growing louder. From the quarters, from the throats of her people, came the sound of singing. "Before I'd be a slave, I'd be buried in my grave, and go home to my Lord and be free." The whisper spread through the quarters like wildfire. She bit the devil himself. Tomorrow they gonna make her pay. But she showed us something. Showed us that we ain't gotta bow complete. Showed us that resistance is possible, even if it cost everything. And in that dark shed, bound and alone, Harriet smiled. Because she'd done what she set out to do. She'd refused to be broken. And that refusal, that one act of defiant courage, would echo through the ages, inspiring generations yet unborn to stand up, to fight back, to claim their humanity in the face of dehumanization. Tomorrow would bring pain beyond imagining. But tonight, in this moment, Harriet was free, truly free, in the only way that mattered. Her spirit remained unbroken. Lord, have mercy. The morning of the punishment dawned gray and heavy, like the sky itself was mourning what was about to unfold. The air hung thick with the promise of rain that wouldn't come, leaving everything feeling oppressive and wrong, like nature itself was holding its breath. Harriet heard the construction begin just after sunrise, the sound of hammers on wood, the shouts of overseers directing the work, the scrape and thud of lumber being dragged across the yard. They was building her stage, her platform of suffering, right there in the open space between the big house and the quarters where everyone could see. She'd spent the night in that cramped, dark shed, her body aching from being forced to stand in such a confined space, her throat parched from lack of water, her mind wandering between prayer and memory. She thought about her mama Abini, wondered if this was how she'd felt in her final days, knowing death was coming, knowing there was no escape, finding some kind of peace in the certainty of it all. She thought about her babies, Moses and Sarah. Had they cried themselves to sleep last night? Did they understand what was happening, or was they too young to grasp the horror of it? Old Mama Zuri would be with them, she knew. The conjure woman would hold them close, sing them songs of ancestors and spirits, prepare them as best she could for what they was about to witness. The shed door opened, blinding light pouring in after so many hours of darkness. 2 overseers stood there, Pritchard and a younger man named Coleman, both armed with pistols at their belts and clubs in their hands. "Time to go, girl," Pritchard said, not unkindly. Even he seemed disturbed by what was about to happen, though he'd never admit it aloud. "You gonna walk peaceful-like, or do we need to drag you?" Harriet stepped out into the morning light, squinting against the brightness. Her legs trembled from standing all night, and she stumbled, catching herself against the doorframe. "I'll walk," she said, her voice hoarse from thirst. "I ain't gonna give you the satisfaction of dragging me." They bound her hands in front of her this time. A small mercy, perhaps, or maybe just practical consideration for what was to come. As they led her across the yard toward the platform, Harriet could see it taking shape. A wooden stage about 4 feet high, big enough for several people to stand on, with a single chair in the center. A whipping post stood nearby, its dark wood scarred from years of use, a silent witness to countless punishments. But what caught Harriet's attention most was the crowd already gathering. Every enslaved person on Wexford plantation had been ordered to attend. Over 200 souls, from the oldest field hands to the youngest children. They stood in a semicircle around the platform, their faces a mixture of fear, sorrow, and something else. Anger, solidarity, recognition that what was happening to Harriet could happen to any of them. Harriet searched the crowd for her children and found them near the front, held by old Mama Zuri. Little Moses stood rigid, his young face set in the expression of forced bravery that broke Harriet's heart. Sarah clung to the old woman's skirts, her face buried, not understanding why Mama was being led to that stage like a criminal. When Moses saw her, his composure cracked. "Mama!" he cried out, his voice high and desperate. "Mama, what they gonna do to you?" Harriet wanted to run to him, to hold him one last time, to tell him everything would be all right even though it wouldn't. But the overseers held her firm, dragging her toward the platform steps. "Be strong, baby," she called back. "Remember what Grandmama Abeni taught us. They can chain our bodies, but they can't chain our spirits. You be strong for your sister, you hear me?" Old Mama Zuri pulled the children close, her ancient face wet with tears she made no effort to hide. Around her, other women from the quarters sobbed openly, while the men stood with clenched fists and faces carved from stone, forcing themselves to witness, to remember, to carry this memory forward. As Harriet climbed the steps to the platform, She saw more people arriving, white folks this time. Massa Wexford and his wife, dressed in they Sunday finery like this was some kind of social event. Other plantation owners from neighboring estates come to witness the spectacle and take the lesson back to their own enslaved populations. Poor whites from town, drawn by news of the punishment like vultures to carrion, grinning and joking among themselves. And there, standing at the edge of the platform with his bandaged hand and his face full of vindictive triumph, was Silas Crowe. He'd been drinking already. She could see it in the redness of his eyes, the slight sway of his stance. He held a small wooden box in his good hand, and when he opened it, Harriet saw what lay inside. Pliers. Rusty metal pliers, what the old folks called allocate sicker, with jaws designed to grip and tear. The very sight of them made her knees weak, but she forced herself to stand tall, to show no fear even as terror clawed at her insides. The overseer Coleman pushed her down into the chair and bound her to it, rope around her chest, around her arms, around her legs. She was immobilized, unable to move anything except her head. The wood of the chair was rough and splintered, pressing into her back through her thin dress. Massa Wexford stepped forward to address the crowd, his voice carrying across the yard with practiced authority. "Let this be a lesson to all of you," he called out. "This woman, this creature, has committed an unforgivable offense. She struck her overseer. She bit him like a rabid animal. And worse, she showed defiance and insubordination that threatens the very order of our society." He gestured toward Harriet like she was an object, a thing, not a human being. Some of you might feel sympathy for her. You might think her punishment too harsh. But understand this. Every act of disobedience, every moment of resistance must be crushed absolutely. If we allow one slave to defy us without severe consequences, soon all of you will think you can do the same. And that way lies chaos and destruction. In the crowd, faces remained impassive, but Harriet could see the defiance burning in some eyes. Her act of resistance, far from frightening them into submission, had planted something else. A seed of possibility, a whisper that said, "If she can fight back, maybe we can too." "Proceed, Crowe," Massa Wexford said, stepping back from the platform. Silas Crowe approached Harriet with those rusty pliers glinting in the morning light. His grin was wide and cruel, like a demon savoring the moment before feasting on a soul. "Open your mouth," he ordered. Harriet clenched her jaw tight, refusing. If they was gonna do this, they'd have to force it. Crowe nodded to Coleman, who stepped forward and grabbed Harriet's face, his strong fingers digging into her cheeks and forcing her mouth open. She struggled against the bonds, but it was useless. They had her completely at their mercy, a mercy that didn't exist. Crowe leaned in close, his whiskey breath hot on her face. "This is for biting me," he whispered, quiet enough that only she could hear. "But it's also for resisting me in that tobacco shed, for thinking you got a right to say no to a white man, for being uppity and proud when you should be humble and broke. This is what happens when darkies forget they place." He positioned the pliers around her front tooth, one of the strong ones, good for chewing, for biting. Harriet could feel the cold metal against her gum, could see the rust on the instrument that would probably cause infection, even if she survived this. The crowd had gone silent. Even the white folks stopped they chattering, all eyes fixed on the platform, on Harriet, on the moment of violence about to unfold. In that silence, Harriet heard it, soft at first, then growing stronger. From somewhere in the crowd, someone began to hum, a spiritual, low and mournful, like the voice of the earth itself mourning this atrocity. "Sometimes I feel like a motherless child, a long way from home." Others joined in, the humming growing louder, more voices adding to the chorus. It wasn't loud enough to be called outright defiance. The overseers would have stopped that with whips and clubs, but it was there, a sound of solidarity, of shared pain, of refusal to be silent witnesses. Crowe hesitated, annoyed by the humming, but Massa Wexford nodded for him to continue. "Do it," the master said. "Show them all what happens to those who resist." Crowe gripped the pliers tight, positioned them just right, and pulled. The pain was beyond description. It felt like he was ripping her very soul out through her mouth, like every nerve in her body was screaming at once, like the earth itself was cracking open beneath her. Harriet felt her vision go white, felt her body convulse against the ropes, felt a scream building in her throat. But she bit it back, swallowed it down, refused to give them that satisfaction. The tooth came free with a sickening crack, roots and all, blood filling her mouth and spilling down her chin. Crowe held it up like a trophy, showing it to the crowd, grinning with triumph. In the audience, women wept. Men looked away, unable to watch but forced to by the overseers walking among them with whips ready. Children like Moses buried their faces in the skirts of mothers and grandmothers. But the sound, that awful sound of bone and flesh tearing, there was no escaping that. "One down," Crowe announced. 29 to go, or is it 32? Well, we'll find out, won't we? Harriet's mouth was a cavern of agony, blood flowing like a river. She could taste copper and iron, could feel the empty socket where her tooth had been, throbbing with a pain that made her previous suffering seem like nothing. But she didn't scream. She looked out at her people, found Moses in the crowd, and locked eyes with her son. In that moment, she tried to communicate everything she needed him to know. Be strong. Remember me. Carry on the fight. Don't let them break you. Crowe positioned the pliers on the next tooth, another front one. The white folks in the audience leaned forward, eager for the spectacle. Some of the neighboring plantation owners was taking notes, perhaps planning to implement similar punishments on their own properties. The second tooth came out harder than the first, Crowe having to twist and pull, yanking Harriet's head side to side as he worked. More blood, more pain. Still, she didn't scream. By the third tooth, Harriet's consciousness was starting to fade, floating in and out like a boat on rough waters. She could hear voices, some real, some perhaps from the other side. Her mama Abini, whispering strength. Her daddy, singing songs in that African language she'd never learned. The ancestors gathering round the platform like spectral witnesses, bearing testimony to this horror. The humming from the crowd had shifted, changed into another spiritual. Wade in the water, children. Wade in the water, God's gonna trouble the water. It was a song of survival, of resistance, of hidden meanings, and even through her agony, Harriet understood. Her people hadn't abandoned her. They was witnessing, remembering, carrying this story forward to the next generation and the one after that. Crowe was sweating now, the effort of pulling teeth more difficult than he'd anticipated. His bandaged hand throbbed, and he had to keep stopping to take swigs from a flask he'd tucked in his coat. 4 teeth, 5, 6. Harriet's mouth was a ruin of blood and torn flesh. Her face had swollen grotesquely, and she could barely breathe through the pain and the blood filling her throat. But still, she refused to scream, refused to give them that final victory. In the crowd, old Mama Zuri was chanting under her breath, words in a language older than English, older than the plantation system, older than America itself. Protection spells, healing prayers, curses upon the heads of them inflicting this punishment. And somewhere deep in Harriet's fading consciousness, she felt it, the presence of something greater than herself. The accumulated strength of all who'd suffered before her, all who'd resisted, all who'd refused to bow complete. She was not alone. She had never been alone. And this pain, this horrible, terrible suffering, it would not be in vain. Gather close now, children, 'cause this is where the suffering reaches depths that would make even the hardest heart weep. This is where Harriet paid the full price for her defiance, where her body became a testament to both the cruelty of bondage and the unbreakable nature of the human spirit. By the 7th tooth, Harriet's consciousness was slipping in and out like tide on a shore. The pain had become so absolute, so all-consuming that it transcended pain itself, became something else entirely, a white-hot reality that was the only thing in the universe. Her mouth was a cavern of torn flesh and shattered bone, blood pouring down her chin and soaking the front of her dress till it clung to her chest like a second skin. Silas Crowe was tiring too. The whiskey he'd been drinking made his hands less steady, and he had to grip the pliers with both hands now, his bandaged one throbbing from the effort. Sweat poured down his red face, mingling with the blood that had splattered on him from Harriet's ruined mouth. "How many more, Crowe?" Massa Wexford called from where he stood with the other white spectators. His voice carried annoyance, not at the brutality, but at the length of time this was taken. He had other business to attend to, other matters that required his attention. "Still got plenty, sir," Crowe replied, his voice slurred. "This wench got strong teeth, but we'll get 'em all, don't you worry." In the crowd of enslaved witnesses, the mood had shifted from fear to something more dangerous. A quiet, simmering rage that the overseers could feel but couldn't quite identify. The spirituals continued, voices rising and falling like waves. "Nobody knows the trouble I've seen. Nobody knows my sorrow." Old Mama Zuri had to physically restrain little Moses, who kept trying to break free and run to his mama. The boy was crying openly now, his young face twisted with anguish and helpless fury. "Let me go," he sobbed. "I gotta help Mama, please, Mama Zuri, let me go." "Hush, child," the old conjure woman whispered, her own voice thick with tears. "You can't help her now. All you can do is watch, remember, and carry this memory forward. Your mama's showing us all what true strength looks like. She teaching us a lesson more powerful than any sermon." Sarah had stopped crying, gone eerily quiet, her small body rigid in Mama Zuri's arms. The trauma of watching her mother's torture was doing something terrible to her young mind, creating scars that would never fully heal. The 8th tooth required twisting, the roots having curved in such a way that simple pulling wouldn't free them. Crowe had to work the pliers back and forth, while Harriet's body convulsed against the ropes binding her to the chair. Still, she made no sound beyond a low moan that might have been a prayer, or might have been the last vestige of her consciousness trying to hold on. Behind her closed eyelids, Harriet was somewhere else. She walked through landscapes of memory and vision, saw herself as a child, running through tobacco fields with other children, their laughter ringing out before the weight of bondage settled fully on their shoulders. Saw her mama Abini, young and strong, singing songs in that half-remembered African tongue. Saw her daddy, a man she'd never known but whose spirit lived in her blood, standing proud and unbroken despite the brand on his shoulder. And she saw something else. Visions that might have been fever dreams or might have been prophecy. She saw a great war coming, saw armies clashing in fields running red with blood, saw chains breaking, saw the auction blocks burning, saw her people, her beautiful, suffering people, walking free under that North Star she'd dreamed of following. "Hold on," a voice whispered. Was it her mama? Was it the ancestors? Was it her own soul speaking from some deep, unbreakable place? "Hold on, daughter. This pain ain't forever. This suffering serves a purpose. Every tooth they take is a seed planted. Every drop of blood you spill waters the ground where freedom will grow." The 9th tooth. The 10th. Harriet's jaw was dislocating from the force of Crowe's pulling, creating new layers of agony atop the already unbearable pain. Some of the white spectators had begun to look uncomfortable. Even in a system built on cruelty, there were limits to what some could stomach watching. A few of the plantation mistresses had turned away, pressing handkerchiefs to their faces. But the men, Lord have mercy, the men watched with cold calculation, making mental notes about effective punishment techniques to use on their own enslaved populations. One neighboring planter leaned over to Massa Wexford and said, loud enough for nearby ears to hear, "Effective demonstration, Wexford. Though I wonder, won't this ruin her for work? Can't pick tobacco without teeth to eat proper?" Massa Wexford shrugged. "She'll manage. Might have to switch her to lighter duties, but the lesson needed teaching. Besides, she's already birthed 2 healthy children. Her primary value as breeding stock remains intact." Breeding stock. That's what they saw when they looked at Harriet. Not a woman, not a mother, not a human being with thoughts and dreams and infinite worth. Just an animal to be broken, used and disposed of when no longer profitable. By the 12th tooth, Harriet had stopped moving entirely. Her body hung limp in the ropes, held upright only by the bindings. Blood dripped steadily from her ruined mouth, forming a dark puddle on the platform beneath the chair. "She'd passed out," Coleman observed, stepping closer to check. "Want me to wake her up, Massa Crowe?" Crowe paused, considering. Part of him wanted her conscious for every moment of suffering, but another part, the part that was exhausted and his hand was throbbing fierce, just wanted this over with. Keep going, he decided. Conscious or not, the lesson's the same. Every darky here is seeing what happens when you defy white authority. But in the crowd, something else was happening. The humming had stopped, replaced by a different kind of silence. Not submission, but witness. Every person forced to watch this atrocity was etching it into their memory, filing it away in the collective consciousness of the enslaved community. This story would be told in whispers for generations. Harriet's name would become legend in the quarters, passed down like sacred text. Remember Harriet, who bit the overseer's hand and refused to bow complete. Remember what they did to her, remember, and never forget. The 13th, 14th, 15th teeth came out in quick succession, Crowe working with grim determination now. His own hand was bleeding again, the wound reopened by the effort. Blood mixed with blood. Oppressor and oppressed, both spilling their life essence on that cursed platform. In her unconscious state, Harriet was having visions more vivid than waking life. She saw a woman, powerful, strong, with a shotgun in her hands and freedom in her eyes, leading people north through darkness. She saw children learning to read in secret schools, their faces alight with the joy of knowledge. She saw churches rising from the ashes of slavery, filled with voices raised in songs of deliverance. She saw her own children, Moses grown into a man, teaching others about resistance and dignity. Sarah, scarred by this day but not broken, telling her own children about the grandmother who refused to submit. "Your suffering ain't meaningless," the ancestors whispered. "Every generation pays a price, so the next can rise higher. You paying it now, daughter. You paying it in blood and bone and teeth scattered on a platform. But the seeds you planting will grow into mighty trees." By the 20th tooth, even some of the overseers were looking queasy. This had gone from punishment to torture to something approaching ritual sacrifice, a blood offering to the altar of white supremacy. Old Mama Zuri was chanting openly now, her voice rising above the crowd's silence. Earth receive her blood, sky witness her pain. Ancestors carry her spirit when this flesh can bear no more. The overseers moved toward her, whips raised, but Massa Wexford shook his head. Let the old woman chant. It didn't matter. Nothing could stop what was happening on that platform. 21, 22, 23. Harriet's face was unrecognizable now, swollen grotesquely, her features distorted by trauma. Blood had stopped flowing as freely, her body shutting down, going into shock, trying to preserve what little life remained. The crowd had begun swaying, a collective motion like wind through wheat. It wasn't conscious, wasn't planned, just the natural response of a community sharing unbearable witness. They swayed and hummed and remembered, burning this moment into collective memory with the intensity of a brand. 24, 25. Crowe was struggling now. His hands shook from exhaustion and whiskey. His bandaged hand throbbed so badly he could barely grip the pliers. But he was determined to finish what he'd started, to extract every last tooth from Harriet's mouth. 26, 27. In her visions, Harriet saw herself standing at a crossroads, that mystical place where spirits gathered, where decisions were made that rippled through time. One path led to death, quick and merciful, an end to suffering. The other led back to life, to pain and struggle, but also to purpose. "Which path you choosing, daughter?" a voice asked. Papa Legba, guardian of crossroads, trickster and gatekeeper. "The path that serves my people," Harriet answered in her vision. "The path that makes this suffering mean something." 28, 29. Only a few teeth remained now. The back molars, hardest to reach, hardest to extract. Crowe had to climb partially onto the platform, had to position himself at awkward angles to get the pliers around them. The sun had climbed higher in the sky. What had started in morning was stretching into midday. The enslaved witnesses stood in that heat, forced to watch every moment, their own bodies aching from standing so long, their spirits crying out against the injustice. But they stood. They witnessed. They remembered. 30, 31. Finally, mercifully, terribly, Crowe pulled the last tooth. He held it up, triumphant, his face flushed with exertion and cruel satisfaction. "Done," he announced. "Every last tooth. Let this be a lesson to all you darkies. This is what happens when you bite the hand that feeds you." He stepped back, breathing hard, and someone cut the ropes binding Harriet to the chair. Her body slumped forward, unconscious, her ruined mouth hanging open, a cavern of torn flesh and empty sockets. "Get her back to the quarters," Massa Wexford ordered, his voice flat and businesslike. "Have the old conjure woman tend to her. I want her alive, a living reminder of the consequences of defiance." As they carried Harriet's broken body from the platform, the crowd of enslaved witnesses finally broke their silence. Not with screams or protests, that would have brought whips and worse, but with a sound that was somehow more powerful. They sang, voices rising together in harmony that had sustained our people through the Middle Passage, through bondage, through horrors beyond naming. They sang not of submission, but of survival. Not of defeat, but of endurance, not of brokenness, but of spirit that could not be killed. And as Harriet's unconscious form was carried back to the quarters, her blood marking a trail in the red Virginia clay, every person there knew they had witnessed something that would never be forgotten. They had seen the price of resistance, and they had seen that some souls refuse to be broken, no matter the cost. Sweet Jesus. Now we come to the part that tests faith itself, the long, slow healing that sometimes hurts worse than the original wound. They carried Harriet back to the quarters like she was already a corpse, her body limp and broken, her face so swollen she was barely recognizable as the woman who'd walked proud to that platform just hours before. Old Mama Zuri had prepared her cabin for this moment, knowing it was coming, knowing that if Harriet survived the extraction, and many didn't survive such brutal procedures, she'd need every bit of root medicine and ancestral power the old woman could summon. The cabin floor was swept clean, covered with dried herbs, sweetgrass and sage for purification, yarrow for healing, mugwort for protection against evil spirits that might try to claim a soul so close to death's door. They laid Harriet on a pallet of corn husks covered with the cleanest cloth the quarters could provide. Moses and Sarah stood in the corner, held back by Ruth, their faces masks of shock and trauma. The boy had aged years in a single day, his eyes holding a knowledge no child should possess. Little Sarah had gone mute, hadn't spoken a word since the first tooth was pulled. "Out!" Mama Zuri commanded, her ancient voice carrying authority that even the overseers who'd carried Harriet respected. "Everybody out except Ruth. This healing work ain't for children's eyes." Moses tried to protest. "But that's my mama." But Ruth gently but firmly guided both children from the cabin. "Your mama needs healing now," she whispered to them. "Best thing you can do is pray. Pray like you never prayed before." Alone with Harriet's broken body, old Mama Zuri began her work. First, she had to clean the wounds. 32 gaping sockets where teeth had been, all of them bleeding, many showing signs of infection already from the rust on those cursed pliers. She used water boiled with willow bark and salt, dabbing gently at the ruined mouth, removing fragments of bone and tooth that Crowe had left behind in his brutal haste. The pain of even this gentle cleaning brought Harriet back to consciousness, her eyes fluttering open, a low moan escaping her throat, the first sound she'd made since the ordeal began. "Hush now, child," Mama Zuri murmured, her gnarled hands working with surprising gentleness. "I know it hurts something terrible, but you gotta let me clean these wounds, or infection gonna take you sure as sunrise." Harriet tried to speak, but no words came. Just a wet, horrible sound as blood and saliva bubbled from her toothless mouth. The simple act of moving her jaw brought fresh waves of agony, and tears streamed down her swollen face. "Don't try to talk," the old woman said. "Ain't nothing needs saying right now, just breathe, just survive." For 3 days and 3 nights, Harriet hovered between this world and the next. Fever took her. burning hot one moment, shivering cold the next. In her delirium, she walked with ancestors and spirits, had conversations with the dead, saw visions of futures that might be. Old Mama Zuri rarely left her side, applying poultices made from roots and herbs whose names went back to Africa, slippery elm to soothe the wounds, golden seal to fight infection, comfrey to help the flesh knit back together. She chanted in languages older than English, called on spirits whose names the slaveholders had tried to erase, but which lived on in the secret spiritual practices of the quarters. The whole plantation held its breath, waiting to see if Harriet would survive. Massa Wexford sent word that he wanted her alive, needed her alive, both as a living reminder of what happened to those who resisted, and because she still had value as property. A dead slave was a total loss. A broken slave could still work, could still breed. But the quarters had different reasons for praying for her survival. Word had spread beyond Wexford Plantation, carried by enslaved folks who worked on neighboring estates, by free blacks who traveled between plantations selling goods, by the mysterious network of communication that existed beneath the surface of the slavery system. Harriet's story was becoming legend, and people needed her to live so that legend could continue. On the fourth day, the fever broke. Harriet woke to find herself back in the world of the living, though what kind of life awaited her remained to be seen. Her mouth was a landscape of pain, the wounds beginning to heal but still tender, the absence of teeth making even the simplest tasks impossibly difficult. Eating was torture. Mama Zuri had to prepare special gruel, thin as water, made from cornmeal cooked down to almost nothing, strained multiple times to remove any particle that might irritate the healing sockets. Even this, Harriet could barely swallow without crying out in pain. Slow, Mama Zuri counseled, spooning tiny amounts into Harriet's ruined mouth. Little sips. Your body needs nourishment if you're gonna heal. Moses and Sarah were finally allowed to see their mama. The reunion was heartbreaking, the children barely recognizing the swollen, toothless woman before them. Harriet unable to speak clearly, unable to hold them properly because every movement brought agony. "Mama," Moses whispered, his voice small and frightened. "Is that really you?" Harriet reached out with a trembling hand, touched her son's face. She tried to smile, but her mouth, her poor, ruined mouth, couldn't form the expression anymore. Instead, tears fell, and she pulled her children close with what little strength she had, holding them against her chest and weeping silently for all that had been lost, all that had changed. Little Sarah finally spoke, her first words in 4 days. "Mama hurt bad." "Yes, baby," Harriet managed to whisper, the words slurred and wet sounding. "Mama hurt bad, but Mama's still here, still alive, still your mama." As the days passed into weeks, Harriet began to grasp the full extent of what had been taken from her. Without teeth, eating solid food was impossible. She'd have to subsist on gruel and mush for the rest of her life, a particular cruelty given how meager the rations were to begin with. Speaking clearly was difficult. Her words came out slurred and sibilant, making her sound simple-minded to those who didn't know better. But worse than the physical difficulties was the psychological weight. Every time she looked at her reflection in a basin of water, she saw a stranger, a broken woman where once a proud one had stood. The masters had taken more than her teeth. They'd tried to take her very identity, her sense of self. The quarters rallied around her with quiet, powerful solidarity. Women brought what little extra food they could spare, already chewed or mashed to make it easier for Harriet to eat. Men nodded respect when they passed her, acknowledging what she'd done, what she'd sacrificed. Children, even those too young to fully understand, seemed to sense that Harriet was special, that she'd done something important. But the masters weren't done with her yet. After 3 weeks of healing, an overseer came to the cabin. "Massa wants to see you," he said, not unkindly. Even he seemed uncomfortable with what had been done. "Says you recovered enough to discuss your future, Harriet's future." What future did she have now? At the big house, Massa Wexford sat behind his mahogany desk, the same place where he'd pronounced her sentence weeks before. But this time, his expression was different. not quite remorseful, but perhaps slightly less cold. "Harriet," he said, gesturing for her to stand before him. "You've recovered, I see. Good. The investment wasn't totally lost." Investment. Even now, even after everything, that's all she was to him. "I've made a decision about your fate," he continued. "You're too dangerous to keep in the fields. Your defiance might inspire others, but you still have value. I'm reassigning you to the big house. You'll work in the kitchen, help with food preparation. Tasks that don't require teeth." He paused, studying her ruined face. "And there's another matter. I've received an inquiry from a planter in Mississippi. He's interested in purchasing you and your children. Thinks your notoriety might make you valuable as a cautionary tale on his plantation." Harriet's blood ran cold. Sold away? Separated from the quarters, from old Mama Zuri, from the community that had sustained her? Taken to the deep south where conditions were even harsher? Where she'd be forever marked as the woman whose teeth had been pulled for biting an overseer? "I haven't decided yet," Massa Wexford said, "but I wanted you to know it's being considered. Think on that, Harriet. Think on what further defiance might cost you. It was a threat, plain and simple. Behave or be sold away. Submit or lose everything." Back in the quarters that night, Harriet sat with old Mama Zuri trying to process this new development. "What do I do?" she asked, her slurred speech making the question hard to understand. "How do I live like this? Broken? Threatened? Always looking over my shoulder?" The old conjure woman was quiet for a long time, staring into the small fire that burned in the cabin's hearth. "You do what our people always done," she finally said. "You survive, you endure. You find ways to resist that don't bring the whip down on your babies' heads. And you remember that what you did mattered. That bite, that refusal to bow complete, it planted seeds all across this county, maybe all across Virginia. Folks talking about it, drawing courage from it. But at what cost?" Harriet whispered. "Look at me. I can barely eat, can barely speak, my children traumatized. And now they threatening to sell us south." "The cost is always high," Mama Zuri acknowledged. "Resistance always costs, but submission costs too. Costs your soul, your dignity, your humanity. You chose to pay the price of resistance rather than the price of submission. That was your choice to make, and you made it brave." In the weeks that followed, Harriet began her new work in the big house kitchen. It was different from field work. Still exhausting, still demeaning, but at least she was out of the burning sun, away from Silas Crowe's watchful eyes. The cook, an older enslaved woman named Delilah, took pity on her, making sure she got portions she could actually eat, teaching her ways to work around her disability. But the threat of being sold south hung over Harriet like a storm cloud. Every day she wondered if this would be the day the decision was made, when she'd be torn from everything she knew and dragged to an even deeper hell. Fear tightened its grip on the plantation. The overseers patrolled more frequently, watching for any sign of resistance or defiance. Punishments became more severe for the smallest infractions. Harriet's example, rather than inspiring submission as Massa Wexford had hoped, had made the masters paranoid and cruel. Yet in the quarters at night, when the white folks couldn't hear, the people still sang. They sang of Harriet, of her courage, of her refusal to bow. They sang spirituals that carried coded messages of hope and resistance. And slowly, quietly, they began planning, thinking about escape, about rebellion, about ways to fight back that wouldn't bring immediate destruction. Harriet had paid a terrible price. Her body was broken, her future uncertain, her children bearing scars that would last a lifetime. But her spirit, her soul, those remained unbroken. And in the great ledger of history, where suffering and resistance are weighed against oppression and cruelty, Harriet's sacrifice would not be forgotten. The scars on her soul would heal. The scars on her face would remain, a testament to both the brutality of slavery and the indomitable nature of the human spirit. She had survived, and in surviving, she had won a victory that no amount of torture could erase. Listen here, child. 'cause this is where Harriet's sacrifice began to bear fruit in ways even she couldn't have imagined. Sometimes the greatest victories come not from the act itself, but from the ripples that act sends out across the waters of time. 3 months had passed since the platform, since the extraction, since the day that changed everything. Harriet worked in the big house kitchen now, her hands moving mechanically through tasks that didn't require teeth. Peeling vegetables, stirring pots, carrying trays. The cook Delilah had become something like a friend, making sure Harriet got portions soft enough to eat, covering for her when the pain in her mouth made work impossible. But it was at night, in the quarters, where the real change was happening. Folks swear on their lives they seen it. A shift in the air, a change in the way people carried themselves. Harriet's defiance had cracked something open in the collective consciousness of the enslaved community, not just at Wexford Plantation, but throughout the county. Word traveled in mysterious ways, through enslaved folks who visited from neighboring estates, through hired-out workers who moved between plantations, through the invisible network of communication that existed beneath the master's notice. Harriet's story spread like wildfire through dry grass, and everywhere it went it sparked something. In the quarters at night, when the overseers had retired and only the stars bore witness, people gathered in small groups to talk. Not openly, that would bring the patty rollers and their dogs, but in whispers, in coded language, in careful meetings that looked like social visits, but carried deeper purpose. One such gathering took place in old Mama Zuri's cabin 6 months after the punishment. Present were Harriet, her cousin Ruth, a young field hand named Isaiah, who'd recently been hired out to a plantation in the next county, and 3 others, trusted souls who'd proven their commitment to resistance. "I heard something while I was working at the Henderson place," Isaiah said, his voice low and urgent. "There's a conductor coming through next month, part of that underground railroad folks whisper about. He looking for freedom seekers willing to make the journey north." The very words sent a shiver through the gathered group. The Underground Railroad, that network of safe houses and brave conductors who guided enslaved people to freedom in the North and Canada, was spoken of in hushed tones, like a prayer or a dream. "How you know this true?" Ruth asked, ever practical. "Could be a trap. Masters sometimes plant stories like that to catch runaways." "I know because I met a man who made it," Isaiah replied. "Came back secret-like to guide others. He told me the signs to watch for, the songs that mean a conductor's near, the places where help can be found." Harriet had been quiet throughout this exchange, her ruined mouth making speech difficult and painful. But now she leaned forward, her eyes burning with that familiar fire that no amount of torture could extinguish. "Who going?" she asked, the words slurred but understandable to those who'd learned to interpret her altered speech. "Who brave enough to try?" Isaiah looked directly at her. "I am. I'm done bowing my head, done waiting for freedom to be given to us. I'm taking it, even if it cost me everything." "You got family here?" Mama Zuri asked, her ancient eyes searching his face. "Children? A woman?" "No family," Isaiah said. "Parents sold away when I was young, never married, never had children. Got nothing holding me here but fear, and after seeing what Sister Harriet endured..." He paused, his voice thick with emotion. "After seeing her refuse to break, I can't keep living like this. I got to try." Harriet reached out and gripped his hand with surprising strength. "You go," she said, her slurred words carrying absolute conviction. "You run like the wind. You follow that drinking gourd in the sky. And when you get to freedom, when you breathe free air, you tell them. Tell them about us. Tell them what we endure down here. Tell them about the platform, about the teeth, about every horror they inflict to keep us chained." "I will," Isaiah promised. "I swear it on my life. Your story will be told, Sister Harriet. It'll be told from here to Canada and beyond." But before plans could develop further, disaster struck from an unexpected direction. Someone in the quarters, driven by fear or perhaps promised reward by the masters, had been listening, had been reporting back to the overseers about these secret gatherings. The next morning, Isaiah was gone. Not run away north as he'd planned. but dragged from his cabin in the pre-dawn darkness by Silas Crowe and 2 other overseers. They took him to that same cursed platform where Harriet had suffered, and there, in front of the assembled enslaved population forced once again to witness, they whipped him within an inch of his life. 50 lashes. Harriet counted everyone, standing in the crowd with her children pressed close, her heart breaking as she watched another soul pay the price for daring to dream of freedom. But Isaiah, strong-backed man, powerful strong, he didn't break. Even as the whip tore his flesh, even as blood ran down his back in rivers, he lifted his head and sang. His voice, cracked and agonized but defiant, rang out across the yard in a spiritual that everyone knew carried hidden meaning about escape and freedom. The overseers tried to silence him with more lashes, but Isaiah kept singing until unconsciousness finally claimed him. After they cut him down and carried his broken body away, Massa Wexford addressed the crowd. "We know there's been talk of running," he said, his voice cold and hard. "We know some of you have been meeting in secret, planning rebellion and escape. Let this be a warning. We're watching. We're always watching. And anyone caught planning to run, anyone caught helping runaways will face punishment that makes this whipping look merciful." Then he dropped the hammer that sent fear rippling through the quarters like a stone through water. "Furthermore, I've made my decision about Harriet and her children. They're being sold. A trader from Mississippi will be here in 2 weeks to collect them. Let this serve as a lesson. Defiance has consequences not just for you, but for your families." The words hit Harriet like a physical blow. Sold. Separated from the only home she'd known, from old Mama Zuri who'd saved her life, from the community that had witnessed her suffering and drawn strength from it. Taken to the deep south where the cotton fields stretched endless and the cruelty was legendary. And her babies, Moses and Sarah, would be torn from everything familiar, dragged to a place where they'd be forever marked as children of the woman whose teeth were pulled for biting an overseer. That night, the quarters was wrapped in a grief so heavy you could almost touch it. Women wept openly. Men stood with clenched fists and faces carved from stone. Children clung to their parents, suddenly terrified that they too might be sold away. Harriet sat in her cabin with her children sleeping fitfully beside her, old Mama Zuri keeping vigil in the corner. The old conjure woman was preparing something, a mojo bag more powerful than any she'd made before, filled with High John the Conqueror root for strength, graveyard dirt from the crossroads for protection, and other elements whose names she whispered in that old African tongue. "This for your journey," Mama Zuri said, pressing the bag into Harriet's hands. "Wear it close to your heart. It'll protect you in Mississippi, give you strength when all seems lost." "I don't want to go," Harriet whispered, tears streaming down her scarred face. "I can't leave you. Can't leave this place where Mama's buried, where my blood soaked into the platform wood." "Sometimes we don't get to choose," the old woman replied, her voice heavy with the weight of too many separations, too many goodbyes. "But you listen to me, child. What you did, that bite, that refusal to bow, it's bigger than you now. It's growing, spreading, inspiring folks all across this county and beyond. You think Isaiah would have had the courage to plan escape if he hadn't seen your courage first? And look what happened to him," Harriet said bitterly. "Whipped near to death, and someone betrayed us. Someone in the quarters told the masters about our meeting." Mama Zuri's face darkened. "Yes, there's always someone too scared or too broken to stand with the rest. That's the poison of this system. It turns us against each other, makes survival seem to require betrayal." "Who was it?" Harriet asked. "Who told?" The old woman shook her head. "Don't know for certain, but it don't matter now. What matters is you got 2 weeks before the trader comes. 2 weeks to prepare your babies for what's coming. 2 weeks to decide if you're gonna submit to this sale or if you're gonna try something desperate." Harriet looked at her sleeping children. Moses, now 8 years old, already showing signs of the man he'd become. Sarah, 6 years old, and still haunted by what she'd witnessed on that platform. "What you saying?" Harriet asked, though she already knew. "I'm saying the Underground Railroad still runs," Mama Zuri whispered. I'm saying conductors still come through, still guide freedom seekers north. I'm saying you got a choice to make, and whatever you choose, I'll help you. The seed of possibility took root in Harriet's mind. Run, escape, follow that North Star to freedom. Take her babies away from this cursed place and never look back. But the risks, Lord have mercy, the risks. The paddy rollers with their dogs, the swamps full of cottonmouths and quicksand, the cold northern winters that killed runaways who made it all the way only to freeze in unfamiliar territory. And if caught, the punishment for attempting escape was severe, often fatal. I need to think, Harriet said. Need to pray on it. 2 weeks, Mama Zuri reminded her. That's all the time you got. And so Harriet spent her days working in the big house kitchen, her nights lying awake weighing impossible choices, her every waking moment haunted by the ticking clock counting down to the moment when the trader would arrive to take her and her children away. The seeds of rebellion Harriet had planted with her defiance were bearing fruit. But like all fruit, some of it was bitter, some of it sweet, and all of it carried consequences that would echo through generations. The question now was, would Harriet harvest that fruit by running north, or would she submit one final time, allowing herself to be sold south, carrying her story and her unbroken spirit to inspire resistance in new quarters, among new people? 2 weeks to decide. 2 weeks to determine not just her fate, but the legacy she'd leave behind. Sweet Jesus. Now we come to the days of decision, when Harriet faced the hardest choice a mother can face, the choice between safety in bondage and freedom with risk of death. Gather close, because this is where the rubber meets the road, where all that courage and defiance had to translate into action or acceptance. The days crawled by like wounded animals. Each morning, Harriet woke in her cabin counting down. 13 days left, 12 days, 11. The trader from Mississippi was coming, and with him would come the iron shackles, the long march south, the separation from everything she'd ever known. In the big house kitchen, she worked alongside Delilah, her hands moving through familiar motions while her mind raced with possibilities and fears. The cook knew something was weighing on Harriet, could see it in the way her already scarred face seemed to carry new lines of worry, in the way she'd pause mid-task and stare out the window toward the North Star she could only see at night. "You thinking about running?" Delilah said one afternoon when they were alone in the kitchen. Not a question, but a statement. The older woman had been enslaved for near 50 years, had seen countless people sold away, had herself been separated from 3 children sold to different plantations. "I can see it in your eyes." Harriet's hands stilled over the vegetables she was peeling. There was no point denying it. Delilah had the wisdom of someone who'd survived decades of bondage by learning to read people, to understand what went unsaid. "I don't know what to do," Harriet whispered, her slurred speech making the confession sound even more desperate. "If I stay, we go to Mississippi. If I run and get caught." She didn't need to finish the sentence. They both knew what happened to captured runaways. Delilah was quiet for a long moment, her weathered hands kneading dough with practiced efficiency. "I'm too old to run," she finally said. "My running days long past, if I ever had any. But you still young. Still strong despite what they did to you. And them babies of yours, they young enough to make the journey." She glanced toward the door to ensure they were truly alone. "There's a woman comes through here sometimes," Delilah continued, her voice barely above a whisper. "Sells eggs and vegetables to the big house, but she's more than that. She's a station on the railroad, helps folks get north. I can get word to her if you decide to go." Hope and terror warred in Harriet's chest. A real chance, a genuine possibility of escape. But the risks, Lord of Glory, the risks. "What about Moses and Sarah?" Harriet asked. "They so young. Can they make it? Can they stay quiet when we hiding? Can they run fast enough if the dogs come?" "That's for you to decide," Delilah said. "But I will say this, better to die seeking freedom than live a lifetime in deeper bondage. Mississippi plantations ain't like Virginia. Down there, they work you to death in them cotton fields and just buy new slaves to replace the ones that die. Your babies deserve better." That night, Harriet sat Moses and Sarah down in their cabin. Old Mama Zuri was there too, and Ruth, the only people Harriet trusted completely. "I need to tell you something important," Harriet said to her children, her altered speech requiring them to listen carefully. "In 1 week, a man coming to take us away from here, to a place called Mississippi far south of here." Moses, at 8 years old, understood more than Sarah. His face went pale. "I don't want to go, Mama," he said, his voice trembling. "I want to stay here with Mama Zuri and everyone we know." "I know, baby," Harriet said, pulling him close despite the pain it caused her still healing mouth. "But we might not have a choice. Unless..." She paused, gathering her courage. "Unless we run. There's people who help folks escape north to places where there's no slavery. But it's dangerous. Very dangerous. We'd have to walk through dark woods, hide in swamps, maybe go days without food. And if we get caught..." She couldn't bring herself to describe what would happen. Sarah, not fully understanding but sensing the gravity, began to cry. Moses, trying to be brave, bit his lip to keep from joining her. "I want you to think about it," Harriet said. "Both of you. We got a few days yet. But I need to know if you're strong enough to try. 'Cause if we go, we all go together. I ain't leaving either of you behind." Over the next several days, Harriet wrestled with her decision. She prayed to God and the ancestors, seeking guidance. She consulted old Mama Zuri, who prepared protective charms and gave advice drawn from decades of wisdom. She watched her children, trying to gauge whether they had the strength and courage for such a journey. One night, 6 days before the traders' scheduled arrival, Harriet made up her mind. She would run, would take her babies and follow that North Star to freedom or die trying. Better to die seeking liberty than live in deeper bondage. But fate, as it often does, had other plans. The next morning, Harriet woke to find Moses burning with fever. His skin was hot to the touch, and he shivered violently despite being covered with every blanket in the cabin. Sarah too showed signs of illness, though not as severe as her brothers. "No, no, no," Harriet whispered, her heart sinking. This couldn't be happening. Not now. Not when escape was so close. Old Mama Zuri came immediately, her healer's instincts kicking in. She examined Moses with practiced hands, felt his forehead, looked at his eyes and tongue. "It's the fever that goes around this time of year," she said gravely. "Not usually fatal, but it takes time to pass. A week, maybe 2, before he'll be strong enough to travel." "We don't have 2 weeks," Harriet said, desperation creeping into her voice. "The trader comes in 6 days. "Then you got a new choice to make," Mama Zuri said quietly. "Wait for him to recover and risk the trader taking you, or run without him." The words hung in the air like a death sentence. Run without Moses? Leave her son behind? The very thought was unbearable, impossible, unthinkable. But Mama Zuri pressed on, her ancient voice heavy with sorrow. "If you stay, all 3 of you go to Mississippi. If you run now with just Sarah, at least one of your children escapes bondage. Moses is sick but not in danger of dying. I can care for him, and maybe you can come back for him one day when you established up north, or send someone else to guide him." Harriet looked at her fevered son, his face flushed and his breathing labored. Then at Sarah, healthy but scared, clinging to her mother's skirts. Then at Mama Zuri, whose eyes held the terrible wisdom of someone who'd made impossible choices before. "I can't," Harriet whispered. "I can't leave him." What kind of mother abandons her sick child? "The kind who wants at least one of her children to live free," Ruth interjected, speaking for the first time. "Harriet, listen to reason. If you all go to Mississippi, both children grow up in bondage, maybe worse bondage than here. If you run with Sarah now, she has a chance. Moses has a chance of being brought north later. But if you wait and the trader takes all of you, there ain't no chances left. The impossible calculus of slavery. Weigh one child's freedom against another's. Measure a mother's love against practical survival. Balance hope against certainty of suffering." 3 days before the trader's arrival, Harriet still hadn't made her final decision. Moses's fever had broken, but he was weak, barely able to stand. too weak for the journey north, that much was certain. That night, as she sat by his bedside, Moses opened his eyes and looked at his mother with a clarity that seemed beyond his years. "Mama," he whispered, "you should go. Take Sarah and run." "Hush now," Harriet said, her voice breaking. "Don't talk foolishness, I ain't leaving you." "But I'm slowing you down," Moses insisted, his young voice surprisingly steady. "I heard Mama Zuri and Aunt Ruth talking. They right. If you wait for me, the traitor takes us all, but if you go now with Sarah, at least she'll be free. And maybe one day I'll find my way north too." Tears streamed down Harriet's ruined face. Her 8-year-old son, already thinking with the hard logic that slavery forced upon its victims, already understanding sacrifice in ways no child should have to. "I can't," she sobbed. "I can't leave you, baby. You're my firstborn, my strong boy. How can I leave you behind?" Moses reached up with his small hand and touched his mother's scarred cheek. "You can because you have to," he said with wisdom borrowed from ancestors. "You can because it's the only way. Mama Zuri will take care of me, and I'll be brave like you taught me. I'll survive until we can be together again." But before Harriet could respond, before she could make that terrible choice, the decision was taken from her hands. The cabin door burst open. Silas Crowe stood there with 2 other overseers, all armed with pistols and clubs. "We know you've been planning to run," Crowe said, his voice thick with triumph. "Someone told us about your secret meetings, about the conductor you've been talking to. Well, you ain't going nowhere." They grabbed Harriet roughly, dragging her from Moses' bedside despite her struggles. Sarah screamed. Moses tried to rise from his sickbed but collapsed back down, too weak to help. "Lock her in the shed again," Crowe ordered. "The traitor coming day after tomorrow instead of next week. Massa moved up the schedule to make sure she don't escape. She stays locked up until he arrives." As they dragged Harriet away, she looked back at her children. Moses struggling to sit up, his face wet with tears. Sarah screaming for her mama, held back by old Mama Zuri's gentle but firm grip. "Be strong," Harriet called to them, her voice raw with anguish. "Remember what I taught you. Remember—" The shed door slammed shut, cutting off her words. Once again, Harriet found herself in darkness, bound and imprisoned. But this time there would be no platform, no public punishment. Just a quiet sail to a traitor, a long march south in chains, and a lifetime of deeper bondage. Her chance for escape, gone. Her children's future, sealed. Her story, seemingly ending not in triumph but in tragedy. In the darkness of that shed, Harriet wept, for her children, for herself, for all the enslaved mothers who faced impossible choices and lost either way. But even in despair, even in defeat, her spirit flickered like a candle refusing to go out. The traitor was coming. Mississippi waited. But Harriet's story and the seeds of rebellion she'd planted were far from over. Now listen here, child, 'cause this is where the spirits intervened, where the ancestors reached across the veil between worlds to offer guidance to a daughter who'd paid such a terrible price. In that dark shed, locked away from her children, awaiting the traitor who'd drag her south into deeper bondage, Harriet found herself slipping between this world and the next. The fever came sudden-like, burning through her body like wildfire through dry grass. Whether it was illness caught from Moses, or the trauma of everything she'd endured finally catching up to her wounded body, or something else entirely, the work of spirits preparing her for revelation. Nobody could say for certain. But that night carried heavy spirits, and Harriet walked between worlds. In her fever dreams, she wasn't in that cramped, dark shed anymore. She stood at a crossroads, that mystical place where the veil is thin, where spirits gather, where decisions made ripple through eternity. The red clay beneath her feet glowed with an otherworldly light, and the air shimmered like heat rising from summer pavement. "You come to the crossroads, daughter," a voice said, deep and resonant, speaking in a tongue that was somehow both African and English, both ancient and immediate. "Every soul comes here eventually. The question is, which path you gonna take?" Harriet turned and saw him, Papa Legba, guardian of crossroads, trickster and gatekeeper. the one who opens doors between worlds. He appeared as an old man leaning on a cane, his face lined with the wisdom of ages, his eyes holding the knowledge of all who'd ever stood at this intersection. "I'm locked in a shed," Harriet said, her voice, in this vision, clear and strong, unmarred by the loss of her teeth. "How can I take any path when I can't even move?" Papa Legba laughed, a sound like thunder rolling across distant hills. "You thinking too small, child. You thinking with the mind of the enslaved when you got the soul of the free. Paths ain't always about where your feet can walk. Sometimes they about where your spirit can fly." He gestured with his cane, and suddenly Harriet could see multiple paths stretching out from the crossroads, each one showing a different future. Down one path she saw herself and her children in Mississippi. Moses recovered from his fever but broken in spirit. Sarah grown into a young woman who'd forgotten how to smile, herself old before her time, toothless and worn down by endless labor in cotton fields that stretched to the horizon. But they were together, alive, surviving. Down another path she saw herself alone, escaped north somehow, living free in a cold northern city, working as a washerwoman or cook, always looking over her shoulder for slave catchers, always carrying the guilt of children left behind, free but forever fractured. Down a third path she saw something that made her heart stop. She saw herself and her children dead, caught during an escape attempt, killed by patrollers or their dogs, bodies left in some nameless swamp as a warning to others who might dare to run. But there was a fourth path, shrouded in mist, hard to see clearly, and it was toward this path that Papa Legba pointed his cane. "Look closer," he commanded. Harriet stepped toward the misty path, and as she did, the vision cleared. She saw herself standing on free soil, not alone, but surrounded by people. She saw herself speaking to crowds, telling her story, the story of her defiance and suffering. She saw her toothless mouth not as a mark of shame, but as a badge of honor, physical proof of resistance, a living testimony to the brutality of slavery and the unbreakable nature of the human spirit. And she saw her children, not immediately, but eventually, saw Moses as a grown man, educated and eloquent, speaking at abolition meetings. Saw Sarah teaching freed children to read and write. Saw a future where their suffering had meaning, where their story inspired others to resist, to fight, to claim their humanity. "This path," Papa Legba said, "it ain't easy. It requires sacrifice you can't even imagine yet. It require faith when all seems lost. It require you to let go of what you can control and trust in what the ancestors got planned." "But my children," Harriet protested. "How can I leave them behind? What kind of mother abandons her babies?" "The kind who understands that sometimes the best gift you can give your children ain't your presence but your example," Papa Legba replied. "The kind who knows that one person living free and telling the truth can do more to break the chains than 1,000 people living quiet in bondage." Then the crossroads shifted, and Harriet found herself in a different vision. She stood in the middle passage, in the belly of a slave ship surrounded by the chained bodies of her ancestors. The stench was overwhelming, the suffering absolute. But the people, Lord of glory, the people were singing. Despite their chains, despite the horror, they sang songs of home, of Africa, of spirits that couldn't be chained even when bodies were. "You come from these people," a new voice said. Harriet turned and saw her mama, Abeni, standing among the chained multitude. But in this vision, Abeni wasn't broken or bent. She stood tall and proud, her eyes blazing with divine fire. "Mama!" Harriet cried, reaching for her. "Hush now, daughter," Abeni said, her voice filled with love and strength. "I come to tell you something important. You think you failed because you got caught planning to escape. You think you failed because you trapped in that shed, about to be sold south. But you don't understand. You already succeeded." "How?" Harriet asked, tears streaming down her face. "How can you say that when I'm about to lose everything?" "Because you showed them, showed all of them, that submission ain't inevitable," Abeni replied. "You bit the hand that whipped you. You refused to bow your head complete. And that act, that one moment of defiance, it's rippling outward like stones thrown in still water. You can't see it yet, but it's changing things. Around a beanie, the other ancestors began to speak, their voices overlapping like a choir. Your story being told in quarters all across Virginia. Folks drawing courage from your example. The system cracking, child, one act of resistance at a time. You think you fighting alone, but you part of something bigger. The fire you started gonna keep burning long after you gone. Then her daddy appeared, the man she'd never known in life, sold away before she could remember his face. But here in this vision she knew him instantly. He had Moses's eyes, Sarah's gentle smile. "My daughter," he said, his voice breaking with emotion. "You carrying on what I started. Every time I slowed my work just a little, every time I sang songs in the old tongue they couldn't understand. Every time I refused to completely break, I was resisting. And you? You took that resistance and made it visible, made it undeniable." He reached out and touched her scarred face, her toothless mouth with infinite tenderness. "These scars ain't marks of defeat," he said. "They badges of honor. Proof that you fought, proof that you refused. And every person who sees them, every person who hears your story, they gonna remember. Resistance is possible." The vision shifted again. Now Harriet stood in a future she couldn't quite comprehend. Saw black people walking free. Saw schools where black children learned. Saw churches where black preachers spoke of liberation. Saw a war that would tear the nation apart but ultimately break the chains. "This future ain't certain," Papa Legba said, reappearing beside her. "It depend on choices made by thousands of people, both living and yet to be born. But your choice, your act of biting that overseer, your refusal to submit, it's one of the threads woven into this future. You part of the tapestry, child, a crucial thread." "What do I do?" Harriet asked. "Tell me what to do." "You already know," Papa Legba replied. "Deep in your soul, you already know. The question ain't what to do, it's whether you got the courage to do it." The fever broke. Harriet's eyes snapped open in the darkness of the shed. Her body ached, her mouth throbbed with phantom pain where her teeth had been. But her mind was clear for the first time in weeks. She understood now. Understood that escape wasn't the only form of resistance. Understood that sometimes bearing witness, surviving, and telling the truth was its own kind of freedom. Understood that whether she ran or was sold, whether she lived or died, her story had already taken on a life of its own. She thought of Moses, still weak from fever but showing such courage in telling her to go. She thought of Sarah, innocent and traumatized. She thought of the quarters, of all the people who'd drawn strength from her defiance. She thought of the trader coming tomorrow, of Mississippi waiting, of all the unknowns ahead. And she made her decision. If she was going to Mississippi, she'd go with her head high. She'd carry her story with her, tell it in new quarters, inspire new people to resist in whatever ways they could. She'd survive, not just physically, but spiritually. And she'd make damn sure that her children knew they came from warriors, from resistors, from people who refused to bow complete. And if an opportunity for escape presented itself, if the ancestors opened a door, she'd be ready to walk through it. But she wouldn't break, wouldn't let them break her. The masters had taken her teeth, but they couldn't take her soul. They could sell her body, but they couldn't sell her spirit. Outside the shed, dawn was breaking. Tomorrow the trader would come. But tonight Harriet had walked with ancestors and spirits. Tonight she'd seen visions of futures possible and impossible. Tonight she'd found a strength that went beyond mere physical survival. The path ahead was uncertain. The suffering wasn't over. But Harriet was ready. She was ready to face whatever came next with the same defiant courage that had carried her this far. And the ancestors, they were watching. They were walking beside her. They would continue walking beside her, every step of the journey ahead. In the darkness, Harriet whispered a prayer. Not for deliverance, but for strength. Not for an easy path, but for the courage to walk the hard one. And somewhere in the space between worlds, the ancestors heard and answered. Lord, have mercy. Now we come to the moment when the ancestors' intervention became manifest, when spirit work translated into earthly action, when what seemed like certain defeat transformed into unexpected possibility. Listen close, 'cause this is where Harriet's story takes a turn nobody could have predicted. The morning dawned gray and heavy, the sky the color of old bruises. In the shed, Harriet waited, her body still trembling from the fever visions, her mind sharp and clear despite the exhaustion. She could hear activity in the yard, horses being saddled, wagon wheels creaking, the overseer's voices giving orders. The trader had arrived. When they finally opened the shed door, the morning light nearly blinded her. Silas Crowe stood there, his face twisted in triumph, a man who thought he'd finally won. "Come on out," he ordered. "Time to meet your new owner." Harriet emerged into the yard, blinking against the light. There, in the space between the big house and the quarters, the same cursed ground where the platform had stood, where her teeth had been torn from her mouth, stood a man who embodied every nightmare of the Deep South. Josiah Blackwood was his name, a slave trader from Natchez, Mississippi. Tall and rail-thin, with a face like a hawk and eyes cold as a January frost, he looked Harriet up and down like she was livestock, which, in the eyes of the law, she was. "This the one?" he asked Massa Wexford, his voice carrying a drawl that spoke of Delta plantations and cotton fields stretching to infinity. "That's her," Massa Wexford confirmed. Harriet, strong worker despite the modifications, and her 2 children. The boy's recovering from fever, but he'll be fit for travel in a few days. "I don't wait for sick children," Blackwood said flatly. "If he can't travel now, he stays. I'll take the woman and the girl." Harriet's heart stopped. They were going to separate her from Moses after all. Take her and Sarah south while leaving her fevered son behind. The cruelty was almost too much to bear. But before she could protest, not that protest would matter, a commotion erupted from the direction of the quarters. People were shouting, and smoke, Lord of glory. Smoke was rising from one of the cabins. "Fire!" someone yelled. "Fire in the quarters!" Everything descended into chaos. Overseers ran toward the smoke, shouting for buckets, for water, for all hands to help contain the blaze before it spread. Massa Wexford cursed and hurried after them. Even Blackwood moved away, not wanting his newly purchased property damaged by spreading flames. For just a moment, a single, crucial moment, Harriet stood alone in the yard, her hands unbound, no one watching. And then she felt it, a hand on her arm. She spun around to find old Mama Zuri there, moving with surprising speed for someone so ancient, her eyes blazing with purpose. "Run," the old woman hissed. "Now, while they distracted. The fire. I started it," Mama Zuri said, pressing something into Harriet's hand. A small bundle containing the powerful mojo bag, some dried meat, and a scrap of cloth with symbols drawn in what looked like blood. Protection magic. "Follow the creek west till you reach the old mill, then north. There's a conductor waiting in the woods beyond. He only wait till sunset. Go now." "Moses, Sarah, I got the babies," Mama Zuri said, her ancient face fierce with determination. "They safe with me. You run. You get north. You live free. And when the time right, we send the children to you. But you gotta go now, child. This the only chance the ancestors gonna give you." Harriet hesitated for 1 heartbeat, 2. Looked toward the quarters where her children were, where smoke billowed into the gray sky. Looked at the old conjure woman who'd saved her life multiple times, who'd walked with her through every trial. "Thank you," she whispered. "Thank you for everything." "Don't thank me," Mama Zuri said. "Just run. Run like the wind, and tell them. When you get north, you tell them everything. Make this suffering mean something." Then the old woman pushed her, hard, toward the tree line at the edge of the plantation. Harriet ran. She ran like she'd never run before, her legs pumping, her heart pounding, the bundle clutched tight to her chest. Behind her, she could hear the chaos continuing. People shouting about the fire, water being thrown, overseers cursing. But no one had noticed yet that the slave they'd been about to sell had vanished. The tree line swallowed her. One moment she was in the open, visible and vulnerable. The next she was among the pines and oaks, their branches closing over her like protective arms. The ancestors were with her. She could feel them, guiding her feet, showing her the path. She found the creek Mama Zuri had mentioned, a narrow stream running clear over red clay stones. Harriet stepped into it, the cold water shocking her system, but also washing away her scent for the dogs that would surely come hunting. She moved upstream, stepping carefully to avoid leaving tracks, her breath coming in ragged gasps. Behind her, faint but growing louder, she heard it, the baying of hounds. They'd discovered her escape. The hunt had begun. Terror gave her speed. Harriet ran through that creek like a spirit fleeing hell itself, water splashing around her legs, branches whipping her face, her toothless mouth gasping for air. The mojo bag burned against her chest, and she could feel the protection magic working, guiding her steps, showing her where to place her feet, warning her when to hide. The old mill appeared suddenly, a broken-down structure half-collapsed beside a waterfall. Harriet scrambled up the bank, following invisible guidance, and found a path, barely visible, more animal track than human trail, leading north into deep woods. The hounds were closer now. She could hear their excited barking, could imagine the patrollers following on horseback, their faces set with determination. If they caught her, when they caught her, because how could one woman outrun dogs and horses? The punishment would make her previous suffering seem merciful, but she didn't stop running, couldn't stop. The ancestors pushed her forward, whispered encouragement, reminded her of the vision she'd seen, a future where her story mattered, where her children grew up knowing their mama had fought, had resisted, had refused to bow complete. The woods grew denser, old-growth forest that even the loggers hadn't touched, where the trees grew so thick the sunlight barely penetrated. Harriet ran through shadows and mist, her breath burning in her chest, her legs screaming with exhaustion, and then she saw him. A man stood beside a massive oak tree, so still he might have been part of the forest itself. He was black, middle-aged, with eyes that had seen things no man should see, and survived anyway. In his hand, he held a walking stick, but the way he gripped it suggested it could become a weapon if needed. "You, Harriet?" he asked quietly. She could only nod, too breathless to speak. "I'm Thomas," he said. "Mama Zuri got word to me 3 days ago that you might be coming. Said if the spirits opened a door, you'd walk through it. Come on, we gotta move fast. Dogs ain't far behind." He led her deeper into the woods, moving with practiced silence. They came to a hollow log, huge and ancient, fallen across the forest floor. "Get inside," Thomas commanded. "All the way in. There's a false bottom, old hiding spot from the last war. Dogs can't smell through it." Harriet crawled into the log, finding the false bottom Thomas had mentioned. She squeezed into the tight space, her heart hammering so hard she thought it might burst from her chest. Above her, she heard Thomas arranging leaves and debris covering the entrance. Then his footsteps moved away, deliberately loud, creating a false trail for the hounds to follow. Harriet lay in the darkness of that hollow log, curled tight in the hidden space, listening to the sound of her own breathing, praying to God and the ancestors that the dogs wouldn't find her. The baying grew louder, closer. The hounds had reached this part of the forest. She heard them sniffing around the log, heard the patrollers cursing and urging them on. One dog scratched at the bark directly above her head, whining with excitement. "She come this way," a voice shouted, Silas Crowe sounding half-drunk and fully enraged. "Find her, tear her apart if you have to." But then the dogs moved on, following the false trail Thomas had laid. The voices faded. The forest grew quiet again. Harriet lay in that hiding spot for what felt like hours but was probably less than one. Every sound made her flinch. Every bird call, every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig. But slowly the forest sounds returned to normal. The regular rhythm of nature reasserted itself. Finally, Thomas returned. "Come out," he whispered. "They gone. Followed my trail 3 miles east before they figured out it was false. We got maybe an hour before they circle back. Gotta move now." Harriet crawled from her hiding place, her body stiff and aching. Thomas handed her a water skin, and she drank greedily, the cool water soothing her parched throat. "We got a long journey ahead," Thomas said, "following the Underground Railroad north. Many stations between here and freedom. Many dangers. You ready for this?" Harriet thought of her children, Moses recovering from fever, Sarah traumatized and scared. She thought of old Mama Zuri, who'd burned her own cabin to create a distraction. She thought of everyone she was leaving behind. But she also thought of the vision she'd seen at the crossroads, thought of the future where her story inspired others, where her children eventually joined her in freedom, where the suffering had meaning. "I'm ready," she said, her slurred speech carrying conviction despite its imperfection. "Then let's move," Thomas said. "We follow the North Star. We trust in the ancestors, and we don't stop till we reach free soil." As they disappeared deeper into the woods, beginning a journey that would test every ounce of Harriet's strength and courage, one thought sustained her. She was running toward freedom, and every step north was an act of resistance, a refusal to accept the chains, a claim to the humanity that slavery tried to deny. The journey through darkness had begun, and though the path ahead was long and treacherous, Harriet walked it with the ancestors at her side, carrying the story that would one day help break the chains of millions. Gather close now, children, for this is where we bring the story home, where we see how one woman's refusal to bow complete sent ripples across the waters of time that are still felt to this day. Listen well, 'cause this ain't just history, it's living memory, passed down through generations like sacred fire. The journey north was everything Thomas had warned and worse. Harriet walked through nights so dark she couldn't see her own hands, guided only by that North Star burning constant in the sky. She hid in root cellars and haystacks, in false-bottomed wagons and church basements. She crossed rivers that ran cold enough to freeze the marrow in your bones, walked through swamps where cottonmouth slithered, and quicksand waited to swallow the unwary. She went days without eating, weeks living on scraps and hope. Her feet bled through the rags wrapped around them. Her body, already scarred and broken from the platform torture, suffered new wounds from briars and branches, from falls and near captures. But she kept moving, kept following that drinking gourd in the sky, kept trusting in the ancestors and the network of brave souls, black and white both, who risked everything to guide freedom seekers to the promised land. 3 months after fleeing Wexford Plantation, Harriet crossed the border into Pennsylvania. Free soil. She stood there on that invisible line between bondage and liberty, and for the first time in her life, she breathed air that no master could claim. Thomas, who'd guided her all this way, smiled through his exhaustion. "You made it, Sister Harriet," he said. "You free now, truly free." But freedom, Harriet discovered, was more complicated than just geography. Yes, her body was no longer property. Yes, no overseer could whip her, no master could sell her. But her heart remained in Virginia, with Moses and Sarah, with old Mama Zuri, with all the people still suffering in bondage. She settled in Philadelphia, in a community of free blacks and escaped slaves who'd built lives in the shadow of liberty. She found work as a laundress, her scarred hands scrubbing clothes till they were clean, her toothless mouth making speech difficult, but not impossible. And she began to tell her story. At first, it was just whispers in the black community. The woman who bit the overseer's hand and had all her teeth pulled as punishment. But word spread. Abolitionists heard about her. White folks and black both who dedicated their lives to ending the peculiar institution. They asked her to speak at meetings, to share her testimony, to show her scars as proof of slavery's brutality. Harriet stood before crowds, small ones at first, then larger, and spoke. Her slurred, toothless speech made some strain to understand, but the power of her story transcended perfect diction. She opened her mouth wide, showed the empty sockets where her teeth had been, and said in words that cut like knives, "This is what they do when you refuse to submit. This is the price of resistance. But I tell you, I'd pay it again, because my spirit remains unbroken." People wept when she spoke. Some from pity, yes, but more from recognition of the indomitable strength that radiated from this scarred, broken, triumphant woman. Her testimony appeared in abolitionist newspapers. Frederick Douglass himself, that great orator and former slave, sought her out, listened to her story, and included her account in his speeches. If you want to understand the true face of slavery, Douglass would thunder from podiums across the North, look at Sister Harriet. See what they did to her for the crime of defending her dignity, and understand that every enslaved person in the South carries similar scars, some visible, most hidden in the chambers of the soul. But Harriet's greatest desire remained unfulfilled: reunion with her children. She saved every penny from her laundry work, contributed to the Underground Railroad, and waited for word that Moses and Sarah might be guided north. 2 years after her escape, a letter arrived, not from her children, but about them. Old Mama Zuri had died, the letter said, passing peacefully in her sleep with the names of African spirits on her lips. Before she died, she'd arranged for Moses, now 10 years old and fully recovered, to be guided north by conductors she'd trained in the route work and resistance. Harriet stood at the station when Moses arrived, barely recognizing the boy who'd grown tall and strong in the years apart. When he saw her, when he saw his mama standing there alive and free, he ran into her arms with a cry that carried all the pain and joy of their separation. "Mama," he sobbed, "I knew you'd make it. I knew the ancestors would protect you." They held each other for a long time, weeping, laughing, thanking God and the spirits for bringing them together again. Moses told her about life after her escape, how Massa Wexford had raged, how Silas Crowe had drunk himself into an early grave cursing her name, how the quarters had mourned old Mama Zuri but celebrated her sacrifice, and he told her about Sarah. "She's still there, Mama," he said, his voice breaking. "Massa wouldn't let her go. Said she's too valuable. But the conductors are working on it. They gonna get her out. I know they will." And they did. 3 years later, when the nation was tearing itself apart in civil war, that great conflagration that would finally shatter the chains, Sarah was guided north by brave conductors who risked their lives to bring one more soul to freedom. The reunion of mother and daughter was bittersweet. Sarah was 13 now, no longer the innocent 6-year-old who'd watched her mama's teeth being pulled. The trauma had marked her deeply, left scars that would never fully heal. But she was alive. She was free. And she was home. Together, Harriet, Moses, and Sarah, they built a life in Philadelphia. Moses became a teacher, educating newly freed children. Sarah, despite her scars, became a healer, learning medicine and tending to the sick in the Black community. And Harriet continued telling her story, bearing witness to the brutality of slavery and the power of resistance. When the war ended and emancipation became law, Harriet traveled south for the first time since her escape. She returned to Virginia, to the land where she'd been enslaved, where her teeth had been torn from her mouth, where her blood had soaked into the platform wood. Wexford Plantation was in ruins, burned during the war, the big house a skeleton of charred timbers, the quarters abandoned and overgrown. But Harriet walked those fields anyway, feeling the presence of her Mama Abini, of old Mama Zuri, of all the ancestors who'd suffered and died on this cursed ground. She knelt at the spot where the platform had stood and whispered a prayer, not of vengeance, but of remembrance. She forgave nothing, but she honored everything: the suffering, the resistance, the unbreakable spirit that had carried her people through the dark night of bondage. Years passed. Harriet grew old, her body bent with age and the accumulated trauma of everything she'd endured. But her spirit, Lord of Glory, her spirit remained fierce until the very end. She lived to see Reconstruction, saw Black people voting and holding office, saw schools rising where once there'd been only ignorance enforced by law. She saw her grandchildren, Moses's and Sarah's babies, growing up free, never knowing chains, carrying forward the legacy of resistance their grandmother had embodied. When Harriet finally passed, surrounded by family, in a bed she owned, in a house that was truly hers, her final words were about the bite. "I'd do it again," she whispered, her ancient, toothless mouth forming the words with difficulty but absolute conviction. "I'd bite that hand again. I'd pay the price again. Because some things are worth more than teeth, worth more than comfort, worth more than safety. Dignity, humanity, the refusal to bow complete." Her story spread far and wide, passed down through generations. In quarters across the South, old folks would tell young ones about Sister Harriet, who bit the overseer's hand and had her teeth pulled but never broke. Her name became legend, her act of defiance a symbol of resistance that inspired countless others. The platform where she suffered was long gone, burned to ashes, but the memory, that remained. Lives on still to this day in the stories we tell, in the strength we draw from knowing our ancestors refused to be broken, in the recognition that resistance takes many forms, and all of them matter. Now, as I finish this tale, as the shadows grow long and the evening settles in, I want you to remember something. Harriet's story ain't just about one woman's suffering. It's about the accumulated strength of millions who endured the unendurable. It's about the ancestors who crossed the middle passage in chains but kept their spirits free. It's about every mother who watched her children sold away, every father who bore the whip without bowing, every soul who resisted in ways large and small. Their pain wasn't in vain. Their suffering had meaning. And the seeds they planted, seeds watered with blood and tears, grew into the freedom we claim today. So when you face your own trials, when the world tries to break you, when they tell you to bow your head and submit, remember Sister Harriet. Remember the woman who bit the hand that whipped her. Remember that resistance is always possible, even when the cost is high. Remember that your spirit is your own and no one, no master, no oppressor, no system of cruelty, can take it from you unless you let them. Quem sofreu, sofreu. Quem resistiu, deixou memória. E memória a gente guarda aqui, nos maracos from the quarters. These ain't just old stories, child. These are living testimonies, sacred memories, ancestral wisdom passed down through blood and bone and spirit. We remember because forgetting would be a second death. We tell these stories because silence would be surrender. So carry this tale forward. Tell it to your children, and let them tell it to theirs. Keep the memory alive of those who suffered, those who resisted, those who refused to bow complete. And know that whenever you stand up for your dignity, whenever you refuse to submit to injustice, whenever you bite the hand that tries to chain you, you're walking in Harriet's footsteps. You're carrying forward the legacy of resistance. You're honoring the ancestors who paid the price so we could stand free. Their voices still echo. Their spirits still walk among us. And their story, our story, will never die as long as there are people willing to remember, to resist, and to refuse to bow complete. May the ancestors watch over you. May their strength flow through your veins. And may you always remember, resistance lives on in the mon echoes from the quarters.